live stream, and then let us know when we're able to commence, and hopefully Councillor Hale's here by the time you finish the preamble.
And you can go ahead and start, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Tonight we have two items on the agenda. The very first item is an information report that we've received regarding the Williamsville corridor study to do with the interim control bylaw. Let me just read the notice of collection. Personal information collected as a result of this public hearing and process is collected under the authority of the Planning Act and will be used to assist in making a decision on this matter. All names, addresses, opinions, and comments may be collected and may form part of the minutes, which will be available to the public. Questions regarding this collection should be forwarded to the Director of Planning Services. The purpose of public meetings is to present planning applications in a public forum as required by the Planning Act. Following presentations by the applicant, committee members will be afforded an opportunity to ask questions for clarification or further information. The meeting will then be open to the public for comments and questions. Interested persons are requested to give their name and address for recording in the minutes. Interested members of the public can email the committee clerk or the assigned planner if they wish to be notified regarding a particular application. No decisions are made at public meetings concerning applications unless otherwise noted. The public meeting is held to gather public opinion. An exception to this rule is combined reports, which consolidates the public meeting and comprehensive reports. That isn't the case tonight because there is no recommendation. This is information only, so I will skip that portion. Public meeting reports are provided to inform the public of all relevant information. Information gathered is then referred back to Planning Services staff for the preparation of a comprehensive report and recommendation to the Planning Committee. This means that after the meeting tonight, staff will be considering the comments made by the public in their further review of the applications. When the review is completed, a report will be prepared making a recommendation for action to this committee. The recommendation is typically to approve with conditions or to deny. The committee then makes a recommendation to the applications to City Council. City Council has the final say on the application from the city's perspective. Following council decisions, notice will be circulated in accordance with the Planning Act. If a person or public body would otherwise have an ability to approve the decision of the council, appeal the decision of the council or the corporation of the city of Kingston to the local planning appeal tribunal, but that person or public body does not make oral submissions at a public meeting or make written submissions to the city of Kingston before the bylaw is passed, that person or public body is not entitled to appeal the decision. So our first order of business tonight is the official plan and zoning bylaw amendments being sought or recommended for the Williamsville Main Street study. And I believe we have Ms. Gummo to present that information.
That's right. Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank everyone for coming to this meeting tonight. This has been a very important project over the last year or so, and we're really thankful for your continued support and your collaboration with us and engagement with us on this project. Next slide, please, Derek. So we are talking tonight about an update to the Williamsville policies. This was in direct response to council's interim control bylaw that they passed last year. And we're looking at where additional taller buildings are permitted in the corridor and the design elements associated with those taller buildings. We're presenting draft amendments to both the official plan policies and the zoning provisions for Williamsville. Next slide, please. So what's before you today? As we've heard from a few members of the public, there are a lot of pages to this work. And we do apologize for sort of the length of the documents. It's because this is a complicated project. We've been looking at a number of things that really influence our recommendations tonight, including detailed transportation work, information on servicing capacity from Utilities Kingston, a financial analysis to look at a hypothetical pro forma for a development in the corridor, a new tool that we have at the city in terms of 3D modeling to show kind of detailed urban design outcomes, and also a summary of the public consultation that we've done on this work so far. We also include the draft official plan and zoning amendment language, and also recommendations for next steps that apply to both this work and other city work programs that affect the corridor and are linked to the planning work that we are doing in planning services. Next slide, please. And of course, in Councillor Neal's introduction, he did an excellent job of overviewing the public meeting process, but I do want to reiterate that no decisions are being made tonight. This is an opportunity for us as staff to show you the draft results of our work of the past year and to get comments from you and input on what you think about them. So you can, anyone under the Planning Act can submit comments on this work at any time before council makes a decision. So that won't be for quite a few months. And ultimately, we will come back to another planning committee meeting in November, where we will then be recommending to planning committee a final sort of draft of this work, and we will be asking them to approve that to then in turn recommend to council that they approve it. Next slide, please. So over the last approximately 7 or 8 years, we have seen a lot of development in the corridor. This is good news because in the city, we need housing. So we know that there's a housing shortage right now. And the Williamsville corridor has been adding quite a number of additional units to the city's overall housing supply. Now, I think it's fair to say too, though, that this development in the corridor has happened a lot faster than certainly city staff or anyone in the public seem to expect. So what we've seen is that the amount of development that we've already seen in the corridor amounts to, we originally in the study expected that it would take about 15 years for this amount of development to happen, and it's already happened in about 7. So things have happened much faster than we originally assumed. And so this is part of the reason why we're coming back to the work to sort of reassess and see what we think makes the most sense going forward. Next slide, please. So over the past about year and a half, we've been consulting quite a bit with the community through both the Density by Design project and specifically on this aspect of that project, the Williamsville work, to talk to people about the design requirements of taller building. So what we've heard so far in Williamsville is concern regarding an eventual potentially 10-story corridor if 10-story buildings continue to be built, and some associated concerns with taller buildings such as shadow and wind impacts. We've heard that there's not enough green space and parks and street trees in the corridor, which is quite challenging because we have a very narrow roadway on Princess Street. We've heard concerns about the amount of surface parking and vacant lots and insufficient setbacks of the buildings that have so far been built. As well as concern around the impacts of construction, of additional transportation in the corridor, and more generally neighborhood change, which is a really difficult thing. We've also heard concern regarding the financial viability of mid-rise development, and that's both for 4 to 6 story wood frame construction and for 7 to 9 story concrete construction. So as you can see, some of these points are somewhat opposed, but we've heard these messages very strongly from the community. Next slide, please, Derek. So looking back on Williamsville from where we are today, we're noticing that we're observing that there has been definitely difficulty with the implementation of the policies of the original study. We've found that that is the case for both staff and applicants. And there does seem to be a little bit of a disconnect between the goals and anticipated outcomes of the original study, and then the detailed land use policies and zoning provisions that were put in place to achieve those goals. So what we're trying to do through this work now is really bridge that gap and bring those closer together. We've seen over time some pretty strong housing supply and affordability issues. We've seen a growing need for rental housing in the city, and more over time, a desire to see inward growth in the corridor. This is directed by provincial policy, and it's certainly been directed by the city's planning documents for decades. We also note that the angular plane approach that we put into the official plan was kind of unusual. So normally that type of performance standard is put into the zoning bylaw. That's so that when you have like a specific development that you're testing against that provision, that number, you have the ability to make small modifications or variances to it in order to build, in order to make the policy fit the building as well as the building fit the policy. So when you put a number like that in the official plan, it then means if you want to change it at all, you need to go through a whole official plan amendment, which is quite a big undertaking. So we're looking at that. And we also note that the angular plane in this corridor in particular seems to have become a little more difficult because of that irregular street pattern and the corresponding angled lot fabric that we have along Princess Street. Next slide, please. So the original policies and study identified the idea of landmark buildings. So those were 10-story buildings that would be sprinkled in a limited number throughout the corridor in sort of locations that made sense. Now, the problem that we're dealing with is that essentially the original lot fabric, the original study very much relied on the existing lot fabric at the time to control these locations of landmark buildings. So it tied the requirement for a 10-story building to a specific lot depth. So the reason that that's problematic is that you can change lot lines, you can consolidate properties. So what that did, rather than limiting the locations where 10-story buildings could go, it actually created a strong market incentive for people to consolidate lands. And that was with the assumption that development of those lands would be at a 10-story building scale. Next slide, please. So over time, we heard some concern that 10 stories was gradually becoming the prevailing scale. And of course, the original work was very much focused on a mid-rise character for the corridor to keep that human scale feel. We think that land was likely transacted at inflated prices that assumed this 10-story building scale. And this may in turn have contributed to sort of a lack of economic viability for the 4 to 6 story scale that the study was originally trying to encourage, because then the land price went up. And essentially, I think looking back, we're able to say that the Williamsville study originally really relied on 2 things that are sort of out of our control as planners. So those 2 things were timing in terms of when things would come to market, because our past growth assumptions led us to believe that this would happen very slowly. And also the lot fabric, which is very much subject to change. Next slide, please. So looking forward, we're recommending a number of policy directions, so sort of high level guidance for the city's growth allocations in this area of the city, plus some detailed design requirements that are going to guide development in the corridor going forward. So planning services through this work and on an ongoing basis is working really closely with a number of other departments on the alignment of those associated work plans that impact the corridor. So that includes transportation and engineering, cultural services, parks, and utilities Kingston. Next slide, please. So through the collaboration of Brent Todderan on this work, he was very helpful in identifying for us 4 definitions of success for staff to evaluate this work, that once he pointed them out, we saw that they had really underlain our approach to this work from the beginning. But we think it's really useful to understand where we're coming from if we show you these specifically. So the first definition of success is moving closer to the intent of the original Main Street study. The second is acknowledging the changes that have been made in a planning policy level provincially, and also the current, strategic direction from council and the current goals. So that includes the declaration of the climate emergency. That includes increased emphasis on intensification citywide. And all of those foundational ideas have been in place since well before the original study was done. But over time, we're seeing that it's almost like we're turning up the heat a little bit on it. So it's getting stronger and stronger as we move forward in terms of really focusing on inward growth, ensuring an adequate supply of housing, and making use of the existing infrastructure that the city has already made investments in, and growing in a way that allows people to walk and bike instead of driving everywhere they go. And finally, the last definition, number 3. This is an important one. So we're really aiming for a really clear and understanding policy framework. This is important in part because we found the old one a little bit tricky, but also because we want to give certainty to people who are applying to build buildings. We want to make sure that everyone knows right up front what's permitted, and so that they can make decisions, including real estate decisions, based on that certainty. And finally, we also want this to be an approach that is going to enable projects to move forward, ideally right now under current market conditions. And next slide, please. So this is where I'm going to tell you a little bit about 4 of our high-level policy direction recommendations, and then I'm going to go through some of the more detailed design requirements that we're recommending. So the first up, we want to continue to direct growth and intensification to the Williamsville corridor. So Princess Street has been identified in the city's planning documents, as long as I know of, as an area for intensification and growth. And when planners toss around the term intensification, apologies, I have a motorcycle going by. What they really mean is basically putting more uses where the services already exist. So building in an area that's sort of already fairly built up and concentrating more users and more uses in that area. So whether those uses are residential or places to work or places to play, really trying to get more users in that area. We are recommending that over the sort of short and medium term, we direct approximately 7,000 to 8,000 additional sort of people to live in this area in terms of available places to live. And this represents about 5 to 7% of the city's overall growth to 2046. So it is a substantial amount, but there are other places all across the city that we are also directing growth to. And as many of you know, we're working on a number of secondary plans at the moment that are looking at those details of where exactly in existing neighborhoods across the city, additional development can be accommodated. Next slide, please. Our second recommendation is to, for the first time, consider the financial viability of development in the corridor. And this is to ensure that we will see development proceed in the short term, while ensuring that those good land use planning principles are followed. So the risk of enacting planning policies that are not financially viable at the moment is that development won't proceed. And in the context of a growing municipality, this can cause shortages in the supply of housing. It can also, as we've learned, lead to development applications requesting amendments that are really well outside of what's permitted. And it puts staff into a difficult position of trying to evaluate those proposals without the detailed policy direction already being given to us for a proposal of that nature. And next slide, please. So as I want to try and clarify, because I think there's a little bit of misunderstanding about what our financial analysis has told us. So in terms of looking at financial viability of development in the corridor, we hired Watson and Associates to create a pro forma to test the financial viability of a hypothetical development somewhere in the corridor based on the current land use permissions that are in place. So that means, as of today, with no changes being made, the official plan and the zoning that applies right now. So based on that analysis, they found that those permissions are generally not favorable and that they would likely present challenges for a private market development. What our recommendations today are doing is going through some, what we're doing is recommending some adjustments to those permissions that we hope will support greater financial viability of development. And we're taking this preliminary work forward to you this evening and seeking input, and in particular from the industry, on sort of observations and how this looks to you. So we are undertaking a little bit of additional sensitivity analysis to test the impact of various detailed requirements on the viability of development in the corridor. Through the Density by Design project, we've heard very clearly that sometimes detailed design requirement changes can impact the financial viability of an overall development. So we're looking at that. We're also looking at the idea of providing certainty and a faster approval process, because those two things really also, as we've heard from the industry, those are two really important things to support financial viability. Next slide, please. So our third recommendation is to broaden the focus of the Williamsville Main Street study and its implementing policies. So as I mentioned already, to some extent, in the time that we've been working with these policies, we've got much stronger direction from Council for Climate Change. We've got stronger direction from the province for continuing to build within the core of the city, supporting active transportation, all of those things. So we want to make sure that the policies continue to reflect that direction and that they appropriately incorporate the more recent strengthening we've seen of some of those directions. Next slide, please. And then finally, we are recommending to continue to prioritize the pedestrian experience for the Princess Street corridor in Williamsville. As much as possible, we want to continue to promote walkability and transit use and make this a really comfortable, interesting, engaging place where people want to be and where people want to socialize once we're allowed to again, and where people can go and see their neighbors and essentially be able to even pass each other on the street these days with some space, maybe in happier times we can pass a little closer, but we want to make sure that that area of the street where you walk as a pedestrian is safe and comfortable and a good place to walk, so that people choose walking instead of other modes of transportation. Next slide, please. So these recommendations actually hit on all of the themes that have been identified by council through their strategic plan. So leadership on climate action, increasing housing affordability. In this case, we're primarily focusing on increased supply of housing that we would expect to put downward pressure on the price of housing, but we also are looking at any other options that we can do to basically improve the affordability of housing that's built. Council is very interested in improving walkability, strengthening economic development opportunities, and fostering healthy communities and vibrant spaces. One of the things we know about walkable communities is that the people in them tend to be much healthier because they're able to walk and get exercise on a regular basis. But that's really just one piece of the puzzle. There's a whole number of things that feed into what creates a healthy community, and the work that we're recommending, or the work we're doing and the recommendations we're making for Williamsville really support that goal as well. Next slide, please. So I just want to talk about heritage for a moment, because any work that we do in the city really needs to take heritage strongly into account. It's always on the top of our minds. So back in 2012, there was a heritage character statement created for the corridor. And essentially it identified the heritage character of Williamsville as being based on its evolving nature. So it's this idea that it's changing through time. It identified a number of what they call in the heritage field character defining elements. So that means essentially the physical shape of things and the elements that are there that give a space its overall heritage character. And you'll notice from the list of items that you see on the screen, a few of these are land uses that we actually don't really want to see continue in the corridor, especially things like automobile dealerships and service stations, because they don't make very efficient use of land. They tend to be a little bit sprawling, and we're trying to tighten things up in the corridor and to provide a higher intensity of use. And so some of these elements that were identified, we're not really interested in preserving them necessarily, but they're an important part of the heritage character of the street as it evolves. And one of the elements that they identified at the time that we're going to continue going forward is a really interesting and unique aspect of Kingston in our pattern of streets and blocks. Because of the early date of establishment of Kingston, we really see some really interesting lot lines and street angles and patterns that you don't see everywhere. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to go through a number of our detailed recommendations. So this goes into basically the design of buildings. And this is what we're recommending to include in terms of requirements going forward. So first off, we're recommending to remove the angular plane provisions from the official plan and replace them with appropriate zoning standards in the zoning bylaw that will require increased setbacks and upper floor step backs from streets. And I'm going to explain just a little bit more about those in just one moment. This is to ensure access to sunlight on Princess Street and to provide that predominantly human scale mid-rise streetscape. Next slide, please. So increased setbacks along the street will support a more functional public realm. We're also recommending that people be allowed to cantilever 1 meter above the first story. This is to maximize possible floor area. Derek, could you just move to the next slide? I just have an image I want to use to help. Perfect, thank you. So this shows essentially the building envelope that we're recommending. You'll see the sort of small gray bar at the bottom. That's the setback from the street. then the first floor is, is set back that far. Then the building cantilevers out a little bit towards the street. But then at the fifth and sixth floors, it's required to what we call step back. So it means you pull the building back a little bit from the street. Next slide, please, Derek. This shows an image of this building envelope that we're recommending on a corner. So we are recommending to continue the step backs as they wrap around the corner. But the cantilever and the 3-meter setback, we're just recommending for Princess Street. And while we're looking at this image, I just want to really quickly go over the difference between step backs and setbacks and what I mean when I say that. So a setback is where you can build a building in terms of where your lot lines are. So in this case, what we're really talking about is how far back you need to move your building from Princess Street. A step back is kind of the same thing, but for the upper floors of a building. So it means pulling it back from the edge of the building, but we have different terms for it because it's a little bit of a different planning tool. Next slide, please. We're also recommending to continue to provide mitigation for those transitions to adjacent residential neighborhoods, but with more of an emphasis on broader public interest goals that we've talked about already, like climate change mitigation through reduced energy use and emissions, housing availability and affordability, which is a big part of this, and that experience of the users of Princess Street. Brent pointed the image on the slide here, or sorry, the image that you see here is from the original study. And Brent pointed out pretty early on that this image kind of gives the impression that the individual landowners at the rear of the property is the most important consideration. And that's not really a common approach for an urban area. And the type of building that's shown here with this series of steps is actually known to be quite costly and also not very good in terms of like energy efficiency. So there are some issues with that type of form of development. Next slide, please. So these two photos show what we're recommending in terms of a change in the amount of setback for development. So on the image on the left shows an approximately 1 meter setback, which is what the current policies require. The image on the right shows approximately 3 meters, which is what we're now recommending going forward. Next slide, please. We're recommending removing the landmark building policy and replacing it with certainty and clarity that 6 stories of height are permitted for the central portion of the corridor. We're also clarifying permissions. The original work had kind of talked about like 4 to 6 stories, like ranges, and we're just clarifying what the maximum height permitted is. We're also recommending additional height permissions at the Division Street end of the corridor up to a maximum of 20 stories, provided that the building is built with a 6-story podium, so the bottom part of the building, and that then the remainder of the building up to 20 stories is limited in terms of the size and the width that it can be. So we call it a floor plate. It's sort of like the footprint of the building. The tower portion needs to be a little bit smaller. So well, depending on the size of the podium, right? So we're recommending 790 meters squared as a maximum size for that. And we're also including those lands at the hub, at the corner of Princess and Division, within the Williamsville Main Street corridor, because previously they'd been considered more part of the central business district of the city in terms of the policies that applied to them. Next slide, please. So this shows a height map of what we are recommending. The green area shows the 6-story height permission. The pink at the very sort of right side shows where the 20 stories is allowed at Princess and Division. And then the circled area at the left is the end of the corridor towards the Kingston Center. And we're recommending that at some point in the future, we consider additional height and density there as well beyond the 6 stories. Next slide, please. We're also including some new permitted uses in the C4 zone that applies to this area that are very much in line with this type of urban environment. And I think I know many of you have heard about some of our concerns about our outdated zoning bylaws. I think in the past, we weren't really including all of the uses that should be. So we're really trying to do that going forward. In the future, again, we're recommending to consider those increased height and density permissions as you get towards Bath Road and Concession Street, and the idea of sort of a north hub at the Kingston Center. We're also planning to do additional future community consultation regarding heritage and neighborhood character. Because the character of this area is changing, and because its heritage character is specifically identified as being based on changing, we want to make sure that we stay connected to the community so that we can continue to refine and sort of work on exactly what we consider to be the heritage of this area. We're also looking at additional identification of the heritage resources, in other words, valuable heritage buildings in the neighborhoods adjacent to the corridor. So we're doing that work right now because we have noticed that the side streets off the corridor and kind of a few blocks over, they're experiencing a lot of development pressure, in part, I think, because of the increased development that's happening right on Princess Street. So we want to make sure that we, again, to give clarity and certainty, that we've identified those resources that are important to the city. Next slide, please. Now, I wanted to show you some images from our 3D modeling. And this is a little bit of a new thing for us at the city. We're really excited about this. It's very useful for us to be able to test some of our policy approaches and our specific requirements by being able to model it. So what this image shows right here is the aerial on the left and the sort of projects that have either been built or approved on the right. So it's kind of interesting. It's taking the existing on the left, and then on the right, it's showing you the buildings that are coming online or will be soon. Next slide, please. This shows the same view. And on the left, we have what the current policies allow in terms of sort of a maximum building envelope. And on the right, it shows what we're proposing. Next slide, please. So this is right at the corner of Princess and Division Street looking west. And you can see here on the left, it's the image of the existing or proposed buildings that are coming online. On the right, it shows the current zoning and what's in place in terms of requirements. And then next slide, please. And this shows what we're proposing. So this shows the floor plate size that we're talking about for the taller towers at the corner. It also shows the kind of overall massing of the remainder of the corridor from this sort of bird's eye view as you move down. Next slide, please. So again, we're at Princess and Division looking west. We're a little bit lower down. So this is what they call in the modeling the podium view. So it's like we're a few stories up. And on the left, it shows the existing and pending buildings. On the right, it shows those plus the current zoning and what it allows. And then next slide, please. So this is showing what we're proposed, or sorry, what we're proposing. And next slide, please. So coming back to our 4 definitions of success. So very much so, we think that what we've recommended here is meeting these 4 definitions. We certainly think that some of our requirements in terms of a human scale built form for the central portion of the corridor is pretty integral to the original vision for the study. We also think that this is really strengthening some of the climate change work that we're doing as a city and continuing to move towards those the more intense sort of urban environment in the downtown core where more people live. We also think it's much clearer and understandable. And we're really hoping that this allows projects to be viable. And so we're really looking to hear from the public on this to be able to evaluate how much development hopefully can be greenlit here. And next slide, please. So we're continuing to refine our draft zoning. I wanted to show this just because even in the time since we produced these documents, we've already made some changes here. So some of the provisions that are shown here were included in the addendum, but they didn't make it into the draft zoning amendment. So we wanted to show that to show we are intending to include the requirement for step backs above the 4th story of buildings in the zoning where it belongs. And we're also recommending that we consider a maximum lot coverage for lots in this area at 70%. The reason for that is actually less about controlling the built form than it is about providing certainty to the market on how much development is reasonably able to be achieved based on all of the other policies that are in place. So we're also looking for input on that specifically. And then next slide, please. So in a few minutes, we'll be taking questions, but the next steps for this work is to send us your comments. And as I mentioned at the beginning, although you can submit them at any time prior to when council makes a decision, we're really hoping you can get them to us by September 30th, because that's going to give us enough time to analyze and compile all of that input and work it into our final recommendation. Through October, we'll be finalizing our draft documents and recommendations and then bringing a comprehensive report back to this group, to Planning Committee, recommending the changes. And we're targeting the November 5th Planning Committee meeting for that. Next slide, please. We're open to questions. Thank you.
Councilor Neal, you need to, oh, there you go.
Oh, I got it. I was talking and unmuting at the same time. I'll give the committee an opportunity to put forward any questions or that they wish to, and then we'll open it up to the public. So, and since our vice chair isn't here now, would Councillor Osanek agree to be the vice chair? Thank you very much. So we will go forward. Just raise your hand, committee members, if you wish to ask any questions or seek clarity on any of the presentation. Yes, Councillor Osanek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you. Thanks very much for the presentation. That was really good. If we could get a copy of it, if it could just be put on the council share drive, that would be great. I did have a couple of questions. So on the one slide, I don't know what number on the slide it was, but when you were talking about that some areas might require investment in infrastructure, that would be future requirements than what's in the queue right now, right? Than the planning applications that planning department has right now. And when it says might require investment in infrastructure in the future, where are we talking water? Because I know that in the report, there's the comments from Utilities Kingston, and Utilities Kingston is saying, what I thought I read was that with all the work that Utilities Kingston has done so far in the Williamsville corridor, the water capacity can be handled. So that's why I just wondered if that slide is referring to developments that we don't know we're going to get, but if we did get them, that's where it could require more infrastructure investment, and it's water we're basically talking about.
Thank you. And through you, Mr. Chair. So yes and no. So in this case, so definitely UK has given us lots of great input on the water. Essentially the infrastructure investments I'm talking about would be above and beyond what's already been approved, certainly. But I'm actually talking about a whole range of services. So water, sewer, even streets and sidewalks, like it's really the full gamut. And so depending on where in the city you are, there's all different conditions and different like amounts of capacity. So it's really, it is more complicated than just water. But the main point of showing that, or of making that point was to identify that there are some areas of the city that can be considered fairly shovel ready, but there are others that aren't. And so because Williamsville is one of these areas that is fairly shovel ready, it makes sense to direct growth to it right now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And through you, Mr. Chair, I also wanted to ask some questions about the heights. So I know that in the slides, there is a lot of talk about like, we'll try to keep it at 6 stories, but closer to Division Street, it can be 10 stories. And then for the, I think they called it the North Hub, which is, it looks like MacDonnell all the way then to Bath Road Concession. Then the North Hub, were you saying that could be 10 stories as well?
Sorry. Thank you, and through you. That's a great question. So just, just to clarify, what we're proposing at the hub, like the Division Street hub, is actually 20 stories. So we're not recommending 10 anymore. We're recommending 6 for the whole middle and then 20 at the end. And then we're recommending a future higher number at the Kingston Center kind of North Hub end, but we haven't specifically determined what that height is yet. We've identified that it can certainly, from a land use and infrastructure perspective, accommodate taller and more dense buildings. But we're recommending that that work be left just a little bit while we sort out some of the remaining infrastructure questions there.
Okay. Thank you. So there's still the potential though, like if we're trying to leave the middle then at 6, like it could still be the way that it has been over the last 10 years where an amendment, you know, a development comes forward still looking for 10 and it comes to planning committee. And so we like, I think there's potential that the entire Williamsville corridor could still be 10 stories then with 20 down at Division Street. Like, are we gonna try, like, would we be having more restrictions to try to keep it at 6 in the middle? Or could it still be like we've been seeing over all the years where every application comes forward and seems to be asking for more than 6 stories? Or maybe that's my imagination. Maybe I'm just getting my memory all mixed up with what's happening further down along Princess Street. What do you say to that?
Yeah, for sure. No, that's a great observation. So essentially the old policy framework in the official plan, it said you can have 10 stories if you have a big enough lot.
Oh.
So we're recommending that we take that right out and that we just say 6 stories is the maximum. So we are tightening that aspect of it, but I do want to mention that people can apply for an official plan amendment for anything at any time. So I would hate to promise you that people won't, because they might.
Okay, thank you. And my very last question is,
Sorry, Councillor Neal, may I interject quickly?
Sure.
I believe New has a response to the previous question that she'd like to provide.
Go ahead, I recognize you.
Well, thank you, and through you. And just to add to the comments that Ms. Gummo has made, I recognize the concern that's there from a council perspective. And as Andrea has said, is we've gone through this very deliberately and strategically to look at where we thought the potential policy triggers were that were leading to the number of 10-story building proposals that we've seen coming forward. And based on the way that the policy framework was written originally and passed through 2013 and 14, because it had the landmark policy contemplation, it opened up the door for the 10-story consideration to be multiple places in the corridor. So specifically, as Andrea mentioned, what we're recommending, or one of the recommendations that's before the committee and the community tonight for at least initial contemplation and discussion, is the removal of those policies. So it's clarifying that the prevailing scale is meant to be 6 stories. We're proposing to take away landmark policies that allowed the contemplation of height other places in the corridor, with exception of the Division Street hub. So that's a new piece, but we're removing the other sections that previously allowed the contemplation. And again, as Andrea mentioned, you know, in the world of land use planning in Ontario, we don't get to put a lockdown on saying nobody can apply for different permissions, you know, from a planning perspective. But what we do feel is that we have a very strengthened and clarified intent of policy and appropriate zoning standards to give much better clarity going forward with respect to what we want to see achieved going forward throughout the rest of the corridor.
And we'll always have the curse of spot zoning. Go ahead, Councilor Asani.
Thank you very much for all of that information. Now I understand that a lot better. And I really liked the part of these proposed changes where the setback will now be 3 meters, and a picture's worth 1,000 words. And so when you showed us like the setback in that one development and what the setback of 3 meters would look like, which is in front of Giant Tiger, that area, now I get that. And I'm happy to see that. So thank you.
Thank you. Would you care to take the chair, Councilor Asani?
Sure.
Did Councilor Hutchison? I didn't see his hand,
Yeah.
so that's great, if you would. I will, I just have a couple of questions. The Bell Building, which is within that potential 20-story area, is heritage designated. I presume that no heritage buildings, anybody who wishes to build where there's a heritage designation would have to go through, would have to build around that heritage building. Is that accurate?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. So yes, anytime that a heritage, or sorry, anytime that a property is designated and protected under the Ontario Heritage Act, it means that when someone wants to change it or, you know, redevelop it, they need to conserve the heritage resources that have been identified for that building.
Okay.
Yeah.
Also within that area, there's some interesting, what I would think would be probably heritage qualifying that might be listed, some of the row houses along there. Have we looked into identifying all of the listed or designated properties within the corridor?
Yes, for the properties that are directly on Princess Street, we have already done that work. So the row houses that I'm guessing you're talking about, right at the corner of, just on Princess, across from the Shoppers at the corner of Division, those are already designated.
Good, good. The potential for 20 stories at what's called, I think, the Northern Hub in the report, is it accurate that that's just saying in future, this designated somewhat small restricted area may qualify for taller, but it isn't giving them a foreright at this time? So it would have to go through the whole planning process again to get that qualification. Is that accurate?
Yes, thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. So that we're not recommending to increase those permissions today, but we are recommending that the city look at it in sort of the short to medium term once some of the infrastructure questions have been answered.
Okay. And it was interesting, and I want to thank Utilities Kingston and for the work you've done with utilities for identifying utilities infrastructure capacities along the corridor. Do you anticipate that there might be the need for temporary holding zones at all in regard to infrastructure capacities?
Yes, so thank you, and through you, we believe that we need to retain the ones that are already in place, but we are not aware of any new ones that would be required to be brought in. And I'll just pass that over to Paige Agnew just to provide a little more detail.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. Also, just for the committee's benefit, I wanted to make sure we had an opportunity for you to be aware that Jim Miller from Utilities Kingston is also part of the meeting tonight. And we've been working with his team from Utilities Kingston quite extensively over the last year, looking at this from a density and population perspective and evaluating that against the infrastructure availability within this corridor, and looking at what certain upgrades may be needed for portions such as the northern portion that we're speaking about right now. I think we are doing some additional modeling work right now, specifically looking at side streets and water capacity. And it's our hope that through the rest of the work that we're doing and the analysis that Utilities Kingston is doing right now, we definitely want to look at green lighting areas for development to the greatest extent possible. So if we do have the ability with Utilities Kingston's support to have portions that would not have a holding symbol, that is certainly a goal that we're looking at through this process before we bring the final planning recommendations back to this committee in November. But that work is still underway right now. So as my colleague Ms. Gummo mentioned, certainly there is a holding symbol on the entire corridor now. There has been since the policy framework was brought in with the original Main Street study, but we are looking at that in greater detail. And obviously, Mr. Miller, if you'd like to provide any additional comments, we're happy to invite you as well to be able to share that with the committee.
Thank you. Mr. Miller.
I'm assuming yes, okay. The only comment I would offer at this, certainly at this moment, is as Paige indicated, we are working closely with the planning department on a number of issues, and water, we're currently looking at it more intensively currently. The only other comment I would offer is, I think as noted in the report, the lower section of Princess Street from Division up to, I believe it's Alfred, if memory serves me right, is scheduled to go under construction in the next couple of years to increase the capacity. It would also improve the water distribution issues in that area as well at the same time. So, you know, assuming that if there was some development proposed in that area sort of immediately, you might end up with an H until that capacity is created. But certainly all of the funding and the infrastructure planning is all ready to go for that area.
And it is fairly convenient if we need to resort to a temporary holding zone because of capacity issues. That's my understanding. Is that accurate?
From my perspective, we have used that elsewhere in the municipality, and it seems to be a pretty effective tool. It does not hold up the planning process, you know, because once we have issued the contract for the work to begin, we're fine at that point for development to proceed.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I
Return the
apologize.
chair to you.
Oh, thank you. I apologize to Councillor Hutchison. I started talking and then I saw your hand. So I'll recognize Councillor Hutchison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was trying to signal to you that go ahead, and you did.
Oh, okay.
No
Thank you.
big deal. I'm interested in the question of financial viability raised in the report. There's a study by Watson and Associates. Is that available to us? Is it there?
Yes. Would that be a question for Andrea, I believe, or Ms. Gummo?
Yes.
Apologies, I was having trouble with the mute. Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. Yes, it is the pro forma analysis that Watson and Associates prepared is attached to the addendum.
Okay.
And it's also attached to the staff report package. It's kind of why there's so many pages there. So it is in there. It's one of the appendices.
Okay, so my apologies, I missed that. I'm just interested because the short form executive summary, its notion of affordability is really rather narrow. Talks about secondary suites and the like. It seems to me our affordability issues are much broader than that and deeper.
Mm-hmm.
So how does this help our situation? Since many of what's being built now on Princess Street is not affordable to most people who rent.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. So thank you, and through you. So absolutely. And my hope is that going forward, we can do more in terms of affordability. Right now, we do know that that increasing the supply of housing does tend to support affordability. We know, of course, in some of the major cities in Canada, that's not the case. But for a city that is growing at the speed that Kingston is, and kind of for our situation, we do expect that will help. So that's sort of one aspect of it. But as you said, it's much more complex than certainly just that. There's a lot more to consider. And we continue to look at some of the possible tools that the province is offering in terms of if they ever do a reg for conditional zoning and inclusionary zoning. But I'll turn it over to Paige Agnew now just to address the rest of that question. Thank you.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair, just to add to my colleagues' comments, through this work, we definitely, from a zoning perspective, we are able to benefit from some of the affordable housing projects that we've worked on as a city over the last couple of years, and specifically from consultations with groups like Kingston Frontenac Housing. We're able to identify from a building envelope perspective the particular design considerations that they find most challenging when they're trying to deliver a building at a certain price point to reflect hitting a price point in the market or supportive units for the market. So that's why you see some of the recommendations that we've put forward with respect to, in particular, angular plane, looking at things like reducing parking requirements and certain elements that allow, the maximum gross floor area that can be achieved within an efficient building format to be able to help with notions of affordability. And certainly when we're looking at a 6-story scale, we do expect to see those projects coming in a wood frame construction perspective and building material. And that is what we have seen with some of those projects as well. So we are hoping, while certainly the building inventory and increasing the amount of housing that we have for the city, and as we know, we've talked about this in terms of a council and a community, and it's alluded to in our report, we have just over 2,000 units that have already been approved for Williamsville that are at various stages of the building process. So any of those approvals, for the most part, since the Williamsville policies have been in effect, haven't actually been absorbed into the market yet. So we are going to see in the next couple of years, several thousand new units coming into the market from what we've had before. But certainly, as Andrea mentioned, we're watching closely what's happening at the provincial level. And Councillor, as you know, we're also working on a project right at the corner of Princess and Albert in the street there, looking at a youth hub and housing. So we're trying to balance out all of those different perspectives, but certainly keeping affordability and a range of affordability in mind as we were creating policy recommendations.
Okay. Well, I would point out that youth shelter proposal is non-market. It's not going to have any real effect on the market at all. And really, it's about what the rents are for the middle strata of tenants. That's what really defines what's affordable. So I don't find this to be particularly strong in that situation. And it also brings back the issue of the angular plane. I understand the energy efficiency argument because of more exposed wall and ceiling space. They didn't. I would like to look at can we get the slide up that talks, it was the last set of recommendations, and you were showing slides about current and what we're proposing. Is that possible?
Yes, just please give Mr. O'Shea a second or two to queue that up.
Sure.
And Mr. Chair,
Sure.
also note that
Sure.
Mr. Todarian would like to respond to the question when possible.
Please
And
do.
sorry, just to get some clarity from Councillor Hutchison, you're looking at the slides of current and proposed where it's the renderings of the what buildings will look like on Princess?
Yeah, it's around the time that we were looking at recommendations to start off, remove landmark building policy, 6-story height maximum for the podium.
Yes, I believe I found that.
My notes say, but it basically was diagrams, drawings, projections. Right, now there was a slide that came maybe a little before or after that. No, these were renderings. Comparing, Ms. Gummo might know, that's the general idea. I want to see the one at Division and Princess, if you don't mind. Is that it? Okay, so I just wanted to be sure that I saw where you're proposing that there be a cantilever at 3 meters above the first floor. I'm looking to get corrected, first of all, if I got this wrong. And then 4 or 5 floors later, above rather, there's a step back. And are you showing the step backs? I see you appear to be at a certain level. And those are, yes, there they are. Okay, I just wanted to be, is my impression correct that you are showing it?
Thank you. Yes, so these do show the setbacks and the step backs.
Right.
Although it's hard to, I find it a little bit harder to see them on these images, like especially the setback on the sidewalk. You wouldn't notice from this that it's actually quite large.
Mhm.
So I don't know if it would be useful to see the image that just showed the building with those design elements. Do you think that would be useful, Councillor?
Perhaps, go ahead if you got it handy.
Slide 22, Derek, has the building envelope kind of with all the dimensions on it. That might be useful.
Well, I see this is where you were demonstrating that it could be wrap around the buildings, right? The setbacks. That's what you were discussing at that time. Is that correct?
Apologies for the delay. Yes, that is correct. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, I thought that would be quick. The technology. Okay, so really what I'm interested in here is one of the things that people really object to is the sense of living with buildings, overbearing buildings. This underwrites the whole human scale issue that repeats itself over and over again. I'm wondering if that's what thought process went into feeling that what you've got there is enough. And I mean, you definitely see when you have the angular plane, you would see it stepping back much more significantly.
Mr. Chair, may we seek a response now from Mr. Todren or Ms. Agnew, who both have their hands
Sure.
raised?
Yes,
Whoever.
please do.
Go ahead, Mr. Todren.
Can you hear me? I'm not sure if I've been unmuted.
We can indeed.
Okay, thank you. And sorry for the bit of a delay, but a while back, the councillor made a point that I wanted to provide some additional commentary on about the package that staff has brought to you being not particularly strong on affordable rents. And we certainly take the accuracy of that point, but I'm a big fan of expectation management. And so I think it's really important that council understand that an exercise like this was never going to provide a solution for affordable rents that are largely driven by market issues, including supply and demand. And in the context of the time frame that your staff had, the urgency relative to a holding zone, there was never going to be that kind of an affordable rent strategy built into this specific corridor. It's much more likely, and I fully expect that will be part of a citywide conversation with citywide solutions coming out of your affordability task force and what have you. But as Ms. Agnew alluded to, it's important that council understand the progress on the issue of affordability, the challenge of affordability that this piece of work represents. Because before, while the loophole was open for 10-story concrete buildings with significant step backs, you were getting a built form that provided a lot of supply, but it was kind of premium supply, if you will. Concrete buildings are expensive, stepped back buildings are expensive, and would have been even more expensive if angle of daylight had been fully adhered to. So it's not at all surprising that you were getting not just market rents, but higher top of the market kinds of market rents, because you were building premium, you were approving premium buildings. What this strategy will do within the context of the normal market, it's not a strategy that moves things out of the market, but within the context of the normal market, we're switching to wood frame construction, which is cheaper. We're taking out a lot of the articulation, which allows buildings to be perceived and conceived at lower price points and not be considered premium units. We're talking about reducing parking, which has a big effect on affordability. So I hope council doesn't underestimate the importance of those strategic moves. That's the most you can do in the context of a corridor study like this. And I do believe they will support your broader citywide conversation about affordability improvements. But on the one hand, I want council to have managed expectations on what this kind of exercise could have done, but also not underestimate the importance of what this exercise actually has done in the context of giving you a better chance of having cheaper rents or more affordable market rents in the context of the market realities of supply and demand. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Well, it does contextually. I think the points I made have to be made because not necessarily because staff or consultants believe it, but because there are those who claim, well, this is what we're facilitating and thinking it will do something significant rather than just be contextual for affordability. And so that's partly what I just wanted to point that out about the proposal. So I thank you for the remarks. I get the direction in which they're intended. The
Mr.
Yes.
Sorry, Mr. I believe Ms. Agnew also had a response. If she would like to accept the request, I think she would be able to proceed.
Please do.
Thank you. I was just waiting to be recognized. Appreciate the comments. Councillor Hutchison, you previously raised a comment or some questions for us to speak to how what is proposed in terms of the built form with the setback of the building at grade, as well as allowing 4 stories of height with a step back for stories 5 and 6. So from a human scale perspective, and this has certainly been argued, industry thinking on it is really the human scale is around 6 stories or 25 meters. So when we're looking at the total height that's here relative to a 6-story building, you're right within that livable, that sense of pedestrian human scale type environment. And that was a lot of what the original intent was behind the Williamsville policies, even though I wasn't here at the time and working on that directly. Through reviewing all the material with the current planning team we have now, that was very clear to us that was an important intent, that the scale of what was to come there with insertions of height. So we've tried to be very mindful of that. Again, working with the existing zoning, allowing permissions of 6 stories at present in the corridor. We wanted to work to maintain that as the prevailing scale, but also provide a little bit of relief above that 4th story with the step back that's shown. Certainly we're open to feedback, and that's the reason why we're here tonight. And specifically with respect to your comments on affordability, as Mr. Toddern mentioned, the affordable housing challenge that we have as a community is very complex, and there's varying degrees of affordability. And there's lots of discussion about what is actually affordable. And the way that our official plan defines affordability is really building off that CMHC definition of affordability, which is 80% of the typical CMHC rate, which we know for a lot of people actually isn't affordable at all. So there's varying degrees of affordability, certainly based on your vast experience and working in the housing industry. If you have other specific recommendations, Councillor Hutchison, I think this is a great departure point for us to take further input on that. And certainly that's the intention to do over the next couple of months. If there's specific recommendations that you have that you feel would help to address some of those matters in greater detail that we can implement, we're certainly open to receiving that feedback.
Well, thank you for that. I will say right away that I think the CMHC measure of 30% of gross monthly income is a better measure of affordability. And the calculations I used using incomes for tenants from about 2 or 3 years ago indicated that over 50% of them, if they had to find a place today, they couldn't afford to do it. So, so that sort of speaks to people not moving. And of course, now we have pandemic, we really don't know what the heck is going on. But except we're going to have a problem at the end of August when evictions become possible. So that was be the first thing I would say. The most important thing is the measure is not 80%. That really matters to people. And I think you sort of alluded to that, Ms. Agnew. So I appreciate that. But it is 30% of gross monthly income. And so the other thing that always comes up and has been a real problem for the city has been, so what I see is 20 stories that division, that may be okay. And then 6 stories throughout. But the part of it, what we've got in the comments of what came with the addendum, and one of the addendums for this meeting is consultants talking about, well, we're looking for 6 stories plus 14 stories, or the 20 in the stories, not at Division Street hub, but further in towards Victoria, Albert, and the like. So how are we going to handle that?
Ms. Gummo.
Actually, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Ms.
If
Agnew.
that's okay. Certainly, I'm happy to defer to my colleagues after I have a chance to provide some thoughts. It's an excellent question, Councillor, and I think, and going through the public meeting tonight, I'm quite certain, based on some of the correspondence that we've been in receipt of since the agenda went live with the provision of information that's before the committee this evening, that there are a number of people, property owners within the corridor that are certainly going to be looking for more of those types of planning recommendations versus what we actually put before the committee this evening. And I think, you know, this really becomes a conversation about fulfilling the direction of council as it was provided to us, which was to do an update, to have a look at the Williamsville study, to evaluate, you know, how closely we felt or successful we'd been implementing the intention of that study since the time that it was put in effect about 7 years ago, and then making policy recommendations accordingly one way or another. So we've had a chance to evaluate this based on, you know, an overall population of people that we really think meets our needs to 2046, and looking at the appropriate locations for that in the city. And being that Princess Street, as Ms. Gummel indicated, has long been a corridor that has been directed for the majority of the high density housing in the city for a number of years, even pre-amalgamation. So we're working on trying to feed into that intent of the official plan and see that materialize on the ground, but within reason. So when we look at how we're able to accommodate that within the building permissions that are recommended tonight, with the addition of some insertions of height, certainly at the south end, the contemplation of the ability to look at that for the north end and the compatibility issues as they vary within those locations, we are able to model and look at what the gross floor area would be with those zoning permissions, and then what type of population. So certainly at council's direction, or with a lot of feedback from the community, we're happy to look at that. But again, I think we'd really be deviating from the intent of the original Main Street study. And as we defined within the presentation, that was one of our 4 areas we were looking at in terms of defining our criteria for success and evaluating this policy instrument at the direction of council. So we're here to hear that feedback tonight. I'm certain that there are a number of people that hold that particular opinion. But again, going back to the key principles of what we are asked to do, that has really led us to the policy recommendations that we've drafted and put out for comment tonight.
Thank you. I know you'd never say this, but I think you just told council to have some backbone. But so, and I know that that's an issue that the local district councilor is really concerned about and has voiced numerous times. So related to that, talking about original intentions, I took part in those meetings. Is the question of off Princess Street development or adjacent development, which, you know, we have some interesting, shall we say, examples like on Frontenac Street. So I'm wondering how this, I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I'm wondering how this plan protects against that kind of development that intrudes directly into the neighborhood, which in my view, the original intention was that that would not happen.
Yes, great question. So thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. Our hope is that by directing the development to the corridor itself, that will take a lot of the pressure off of the surrounding neighborhoods. Also, you know, it's interesting, the development on Frontenac Street wasn't actually part of the Main Street study policies. So, you know, going forward, I think those areas will very much be impacted by the new policies that we're going to see from the Central Kingston Growth Strategy. And they, you know, that project has a mandate also to sort of direct growth to intensification areas within the city and let them sort of take the bulk of the additional units, and then have infill happen in the surrounding neighborhoods through a more gentle approach, primarily through second units. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Unless Councillor Hill had his hand up, No, I just have two quick questions that I overlooked. If Councilor Rosanek can take the chair. Great.
Yes.
A couple of things, and I mean, part of the evolution of this from its original intent, and we all agree that it's what we've gotten is definitely not what the original intention of the Williamsville corridor study was. But there are a number of things that happen traditionally, and I just would like to hear some planners say that that won't necessarily continue. I recognize that lot coverage target is 70%. There was a very, very good plan in the original for parkettes and green space to make it much more walkable. The reality is just about every development that came forward, just about everyone, had payment in lieu of parkland. And the result was that we have most of the 10-story developments and even some of the 6-story developments have total full lot coverage. Can we develop the zoning on this and the OP on this new proposal in such a way that we're not going to have the erosion of the plan over time as we did with the original?
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair, if I can begin and then certainly open up the floor to my colleagues to add anything that maybe I haven't covered off sufficiently. So I think when we go back to the 2013 Williamsville Main Street study, and you look at that was never a schedule. And when we talk about a schedule is a map that has status in terms of permissions in an official plan. So what was developed, there was a map that was shown in the original study that contemplated where these landmark sites could potentially be located. And again, it was looking at lots that existed that had the minimum lot depth required to get to that 8 to 10 story height. And originally what was shown was 5 locations. And where we are right now is, 4 approved 10-story buildings. There's 2 more that are currently in the development process. Those are the Ashcroft home proposals that have been grandfathered in under the existing official plan policies. So when we take a step back and we look at the corridor, in terms of the overall number of taller buildings, we're actually not far off from what the study talked about. They may not be in the exact locations, but certainly because we haven't seen the remainder of the corridor filling out, that's been a key consideration for looking at the zoning to try and make sure that we have a successful framework for the 6-story to fill out in the middle. And then going back to the policy recommendations that are before you tonight, removing the policies with respect to landmark buildings. So those contemplations, as recommended by staff, would not be part of the policy framework going forward. So not providing the opportunity through land consolidation and achieving a minimum lot depth to have further 10-story buildings within the corridor, with the exception of the end of Princess and Division, where we're proposing some additional height and density. So I just wanted to go back and clarify what was in the original study. Again, in terms of the parkland comments, they're well made, and that is definitely something that we have heard through the development approvals process over the last number of years related to some of those recommendations. And we're looking at that in terms of the zoning that's before you tonight, but also recognizing that strategic conversations about parkette locations and actual physical parkland taking on Princess Street has been well identified as a priority from a community-based perspective. And we have heard that and the feeling that we haven't done a great job. And I think there's also opportunities that exist within the pedestrian realm at grade based on the overall property setback that we're talking about. So going from that 1 to 3 meters creates a lot of opportunity for additional vegetation, greening, informal areas for sitting, potential parkettes. So all of these pieces together are part of our strategy going forward. But certainly your comments are well noted, and they're ones that staff are in particular aware of based on some of the commentary and input that's been provided by the community to date. And we're top of our mind while we're working through this process.
Thank you. And my, yes.
Sorry, Mr. Todderan would like to provide a response.
Please
That's
do.
okay with the Vice Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I might just add to what Ms. Agnew just said. There's been a number of questions, including yours, that are along the lines of, well, how do we know this won't just happen again? If we had a clear vision and we didn't follow it, and we're just re-clarifying the vision, what makes us think it will be followed this time? Won't we just get the same kind of development pressures that we had before? And I think that's an excellent question to answer really definitively, even if we have to repeat ourselves a couple of times, in order to make certainly everyone who's listening at home understand what this proposal really does. Notwithstanding the original vision of a prevailing 6 stories, for better or for worse, and I'm a consultant, I'm not a member of your staff, so I might be willing to speak more truth of an error made in the past. There was a significant error made in the past that allowed what I've characterized as a loophole that really substantially, and council has to understand, substantially opened the door for 10-story prevailing scale, notwithstanding all of the public process and all of the public expectation and what was written in the vision of the plan. Not only was it slightly possible, it was entirely likely that you were going to get 10-story prevailing scale because of that provision of using land lot depth to identify so-called landmark sites. Any understanding of land economics and land and development and market reaction to signals in policy would have predicted that. And I think it's very important for council to understand that amongst all the other things staff has been doing this past year, they are not just seeking to plug this loophole and make it, if not impossible, at least very difficult for projects and proposals that don't match this vision to succeed, including at appeals to the Ontario Municipal Board or the Tribunal, to make it very difficult. On top of doing that, at the same time, Ms. Agnew and your city manager have been working to build a better understanding of these land economics triggers into all of the policy work that staff does. Because frankly, this has been very eye-opening that the previous work back in 2012 didn't recognize this completely predictable effect from the marketplace. And so as an example, over the course of this last year, to say we as a team, your staff and myself, have been rigorous in running all the work through this filter or lens of what might be called the law of unforeseen consequences, to make sure we don't create another accidental message or trigger to the marketplace in terms of land value, etc. That's been a big part of a culture change within the planning department and at City Hall, a skill set and even training change, etc. So 2 things have been happening over the course of the last year that, as Ms. Agnew said, can't allow anybody to guarantee that you won't have different applications, have made the success of those applications a lot less likely. One is that you're taking away the loophole. You're taking away the thing that caused this all to happen in the first place and replacing it with much clearer language. And 2, you're bringing into your staff a culture of being able to see these unforeseen consequences, particularly market and land economics based unforeseen consequences before they happen. It won't mean it'll never happen again, Mr. Chair and Council, but I, for one, as an advisor to the city, working very closely with your staff, feel that there has been significant growth in this learning curve, but that your staff needed, and I'll be clear, many planning departments out there struggle with the need to. So it's not something that was particularly unique to your planning staff. And in fact, your planning staff is probably ahead of the game now based on the hard work and the leadership that Ms. Agnew has shown in bringing this skill set into your staff.
Thank you. My very last statement, and then I'll get the chair back, refers to what Councillor Hutchison mentioned about the number of comments that we've received regarding people who were land accumulating in anticipation of 10 stories. Way back when I was a rookie councillor back in the 90s, I still remember then Mayor Helen Cooper saying to me, the value isn't in the land, the value is in the zoning. And the reality is all of those people who purchased land that was allocated for 4 to 6 stories. If this goes through, it'll be allocated for 6 stories. Anything else, anticipation of it being an expanded building envelope, was a crapshoot. It was them anticipating that they could accumulate a block and put a 10-story development on it. So I just wanted to make that comment. So if you would return the chair, I believe Councillor Hill has a question. So.
Thank you. My apologies to the chair for my late arrival, but there were some other things going on and I couldn't get away. So
not to worry.
This question may have been answered already, but I'm a little bit concerned. My daughter went to the University of Waterloo, and the Waterloo has gone through quite a bit of this kind of sort of 6 to 10 story construction with the main floor or commercial on the main floor. And I guess what I'm concerned about is none of that happened there. So, you know, we provided this kind of condition or expectation that there's going to be main floor commercial, and if the neighborhood develops in such a way as to sort of not encourage that, I fear that will become like a lot of vacant and empty storefronts, and that the vitality of the neighborhood won't be encouraged by that kind of development. So is there how do you see this plan kind of responding to ensuring that what happened at Waterloo kind of doesn't happen here?
Thank you. Which planner would like to speak?
Yes, thank you. And through you, Mr. Chair, that is a great question. And it's one that we've been talking about a lot through this work. What we decided at this point is to maintain the required ground floor commercial that was identified on the original study for now. So it doesn't require ground floor commercial everywhere in the corridor, but it does require it in certain locations. We would, though, like to look, I think, at commercial lands kind of in the central area of the city more broadly, or at least I would like to do that as some policy work going forward, because we have heard a lot of concerns from the community about the ongoing viability of brick and mortar retail, and certainly COVID has thrown a whole new wrench into that. So we want to make sure that we have enough commercial, but not too much. Thank you.
Thank you. Did you have a follow-up, Councillor Hill? No? Thank you very much. Good question. Seeing no other hands up, we'll now go to the public portion of our meeting. I know that there are a number of community people. If you would just give your name and where you live, and you'll have 5 minutes to speak to your concerns or ask questions. I know we have a number of planners here today, and that those planners may be representing more than just a single a developer. But if I could ask you to kindly identify yourself, identify what company you work for, and please identify what client you're representing in your comments. That would be helpful. So the floor is now open. Yes.
Sure, Mr. Chair. Before we get to members of the public, I see that Commissioner Agnew has her hand raised.
Oh, go right ahead, Commissioner Agnew.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair, just a quick question for clarification on process. I know sometimes when we do these larger consultations, we like to cohort the questions into chunks. So were you looking at having a few members of the public go and then some staff responses, or did you want to hold them all to the end of the public submissions and then staff will respond?
Yeah, I think what we'll do is what we've done it when we've had these very busy clustered meetings before, is we'll allow 4 or 5 people to speak, and then we'll recognize, give you an opportunity so that none of the comments or questions get lost. Does that, I'm turning to the committee. Does that seem reasonable to people? I think that's more efficient that way. So thank you, Commissioner Agnew. That's what we'll do. So the floor is now open.
Sure. Mr. Chair, first member of the public to speak is Mr. Grenville, and I'll just ask him to accept the invitation to unmute his microphone. And I believe his microphone is now live, so he can proceed.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. My name is John Grenville. My wife and I live at 24 Jenkins in a block that fronts onto Princess Street between Alfred and Frontenac Streets. The original Main Street study was prepared with broad acceptance by the residents and provided promise for compatible development. Unfortunately, the current situation has the beginnings of an urban canyon and an uninviting vehicle-oriented throughway rather than the future vision of a city and community destination with thriving neighborhoods both north and south of the main street. The limited time that I have allows me to touch on only a few of my concerns. The protection of residential neighborhoods that adjoin Princess Street was one of the primary concerns when the Main Street study was first done. One of the guiding principles for the study was, and I quote, to protect existing residential areas from negative impacts. One of the definitions of success of this review talks about respect for the original vision. Despite this vision of success, the report states that the proposed changes will continue to provide mitigation for transitions to adjacent residential properties, but, and the but is important, but with a reduced focus on potential perceived impact to individual dwellings and more emphasis on and support for broader public interest goals. I don't know what planning staff mean when they talk about potential perceived impact, but I can tell you exactly what it's like to have a 5-story building constructed 6 meters away from the property line and to have more than 40 windows overlooking your backyard with an underground garage entrance on the lot line. That's the situation for the building currently under construction on Frontenac Street. Privacy will be virtually non-existent. Sunshine will not be available in the winter when we need it most, and vehicles for 99 units will be coming and going to the underground garage at all hours. Achieving broader public interest goals does not mean that impact on individual property owners needs to be diminished. Part of the problem can be mitigated by ensuring that a step back above the 3rd story applies where buildings abut residential zones. Part of it can be mitigated by eliminating balconies and rooftop patios on buildings that overlook residential zones. But most of all, part of the problem can be mitigated by increasing the setback, even if only slightly, from the property line. But even the 8-meter setback seems to be quite elastic when the report says that the setback may include, quote, functional elements. I'm not sure what this means, but it's hard not to think that an entrance to an underground garage will be seen as just another functional element. I'd like to talk about green streets. The staff report states that the green streets concept has not been implemented and gives no suggestion as to when it might be. It's disconcerting after more than 7 years to learn that there is no plan. Despite the lack of a plan, the city has approved community benefits from 2 locations to provide funding for green streets, community benefits totaling $460,000. Green streets were identified as an important element in the original plan. Council has identified the importance of the urban forest, especially in light of the climate emergency. Council has identified almost 500,000 of community benefit money for green streets. The province has identified the need for green infrastructure in the recently released provincial policy statement, and green streets are one of the several elements that was strongly supported by Williamsville residents. Even the city's primary consultant, who's with us tonight, has stated density done well includes more green design options. My question is, why has such an important recommendation of the Williamsville Main Street been left to language as if the Main Street study had never been done and unanimously approved by council? In closing, I would like to note another green concept that was strongly supported by Williamsville residents. That's the development of parkettes on Princess Street. Although the staff,
seconds, please.
I beg your pardon?
I just giving you the 30 seconds heads up. Thank you.
Can you add that time into what's left then?
Yes.
Thank you very much. In closing, I'd like to note another green concept that was strongly supported by Williamsville residents, and that's the development of parkettes on Princess Street. Although the staff report in front of you talks about 4 locations where parkettes have been secured or are currently being negotiated along Princess Street, only one has actually been secured. One of them is an easement of some sort and not a municipal parkette, and the other 2 are part of a development proposal that hasn't moved forward in more than a year. We have seen in the developments that are currently under construction, there are no parkettes in any of them on Princess Street, no municipal parkettes on any of them on Princess Street. The report says that an oversupply of parkettes in the Williamsville corridor may lead to their underuse. This is really discouraging when we haven't even seen one yet. We're talking about overuse. Williamsville has the lowest per capita parkland in the municipality. I don't understand why this statement has been made or what criteria staff are.
Thank you very much, Mr. Granville. That's actually about 6 minutes that I've given you. If you could
they have already
put anything in writing, that would be great. Thank you. And who's next?
Mr. Chair, the next presenter will be Mike Keane from FOTEM Planning, and we'll just ask that he identify which property specifically he's speaking to.
Thank you.
All right, good evening, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, my name is Mike Keane and I'm a land use planner with FOTEM Consultants. And I'm actually speaking broadly to the corridor tonight and the study, while my colleague Yuko Leclerc, when it's his turn, will speak more specifically to a few properties. So I'm just going to touch on a few high-level topics in terms of the review that we've conducted. And so we initiated consultation with a number of our clients, and we provided comments early in the process. And as we've reviewed the study in light of those initial comments that were provided, it was largely felt that they weren't respected, and appreciating that that's largely because the direction from council is different than the direction of our clients. And so a lot of our focus was on looking at sites in the corridor that may have additional potential for height, simply put. And we did look at a number of sites where we thought that more height might be appropriate. What we find is that the sites that aren't developed right now, in the case of our clients in particular, these are folks that have been longtime owners in the corridor, and they have significant investment in their properties, even if they're an older format of development, say an old plaza with front yard parking, for example. And so when they're reviewing the new, much more clear, admittedly, 6-story height provision, they have concerns that really, due to the investment in their existing properties, they won't actually be able to move forward with a 6-story plan. So we'll be following up with staff on the financial analysis in particular, because we do have concerns with what we're seeing and with the analysis that's been provided, that creating a 6-story form that is financially viable will be difficult to do. What we found interesting, and you know, as somebody who's had the opportunity to work on a number of applications in the corridor, is, you know, as was said earlier, the accidental consequences. And that initial study, which created a frenzy much greater than we ever could have imagined and inspired people to develop in the corridor, arguably had accidental consequences. Now we're going to have the reverse. We're taking a stab forward to make changes, and I hope we don't end up with accidental consequences again, where we stagnate the corridor, knowing the investment that's on some of these smaller properties, whether it be building maintenance, new HVAC equipment. In many cases, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars that would be hard to just throw away, you know, say for a 30-year renovation type scenario. So finally, we think that the large buildings in the corridor are actually the success stories. Each building's unique. Some of them are rental, some of them will be condo, and ultimately probably rental through the condo, but they're unique, and they're unique to Kingston. They've adapted to the corridor, and certainly they've pushed that limit to 10 stories. And so our biggest concern is that financial analysis. And if this is going to lock down at 6, we're really going to want to work with staff to understand what a viable 6-story building looks like. And we hope that that's possible. And if it is, we'll relay those comments to our clients and give them the comfort that's necessary that their property is still viable for a new build. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Keene. And you were well within your 5 minutes. I appreciate that. Who's next?
Mr. Chair, I believe the next speaker is Mr. Leclerc.
Yes, go ahead.
Good evening, and thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. My name is Hugo Leclerc. I am a land use planner with FO10 Planning and Design as well. I am speaking on behalf of a number of different clients at this time. So I beg the committee's indulgence. If I do push my 5-minute limit, it's because I'm speaking on behalf of 5 different groups of property owners. But I'll just dive right in and be as efficient as I can, and hopefully we don't get to that point.
I will give you your 5 minutes. Go right ahead.
As noted by my colleague, these are longstanding property owners who own lands at locations that are in proximity to buildings that have been approved or proposed for 10-story taller building insertions. And that's why we've looked at these properties a little bit more closely, because they're locations that make sense for greater height. We've consulted with city staff on each of these sites, and with one exception, our clients feel very much like their input has been largely ignored. So I'm just going to jump right into the properties here and express their key points, which are provided in a little bit more detail in the letters that are in the addendum tonight. So on the north side of Princess Street, on the city block, spanning between Nelson and Victoria Street, including St. Mark's or St. Luke's Anglican Church, the properties here are owned by Mr. Scranage, Ms. Charlton, the diocese, and a Mr. Brent. There's 2 primary concerns. One is the boundary of Williamsville. We've noted through the draft policy framework that the boundary of Williamsville has been recommended for expansion at the Division Street and Princess Street intersection. In this case, St. Luke's in particular has a long history of association as part of Williamsville, which I think is best represented by the recent public meeting held at St. Luke's in February, where the community gathered and spoke about the future of Williamsville. This is a property that is also on a Green Street, and one that has an important role in the implementation of Green Street policies. And it's currently not included in the boundary, and we are asking that it be included as part of Williamsville. And secondly, the matter is regarding this as a taller building site, consistent with the current policy framework, which allows this to be considered as a 10-story high site. This is a location that's a full city block. It has the potential to mirror the building being built across the street with heritage conservation juxtaposed with new and contemporary design. Certainly the owners have an interest in retaining that development potential under the current policy framework. So the next property I'll speak to is at the southwest corner of Princess and Frontenac Street. This is a property owned by the Kingston Development Corporation. This is a property that, again, the part of the property is actually outside of Williamsville, the Main Street study area, and it seems like a very illogical and unexplained aberration that the property is not fully within Williamsville. Owner has indicated that he will appeal the policy framework if the property is not brought into the policy framework of Williamsville, as it logically should. The entire property is not within Williamsville for some reason. It has never really been explained, even though multiple efforts have been made to bring it in. This is also a site that under the current policy framework meets the dimensional criteria for a taller building site. It's also across the street from an approved tall building, 10-story building. Next property that I'll speak to is at the south, it's on the south side of Princess Street, just west of Alfred. This is a site that is owned by Axion Development Corporation. The primary interest here is in retaining the development potential of it as a taller building site. It meets the criteria under the current framework. It is across the road from a couple of proposed building sites, so it like similar to the other properties that I've noted, has the potential to complement the insertion of built height of greater height within Williamsville. The fourth site is at the southwest corner of Princess and University. This property is owned by the 490 and 500 Princess Street corporations. It's actually two smaller sites that have the potential through lot consolidation with adjacent properties, again, to meet the criteria under the current framework for a taller building site. And the owner, has expressed interest in retaining that development potential. This is also across the road from two approved 10-story buildings at University Suites, one of which is under construction. So again, it's a site that makes sense. It's a logical location right next to other buildings where that height has been approved previously. The last property that I'll speak to is at the southwest corner of Colburn and Division. This is a property owned by Cogeco. This is a larger property, and my feedback on this one is actually that the applicants are very encouraged with the policy direction. This is a site that's within the gateway and very appropriate for a taller building and greater building height, as a feeling that we expressed and that was shared by staff and is represented in the draft policy framework that's before all of us this evening. So I think fundamentally this is a property owner that's pleased with the direction, but would like to work much more closely with city staff in the development of policies and zoning that will achieve a fair framework. So I think broadly stepping back, all of our clients are very pleased with the general direction that is being taken with respect to providing additional clarity, providing improved direction for built form, and providing greater guidance.
30 seconds, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Greater guidance with respect to separation between tall buildings and building floor plates. However, these are criteria that we need to work with staff on to massage and to ensure that they're implemented in a fair way, where development on one site does not adversely affect the potential of another property to develop to its full potential. And with that, I thank you all and encourage you to read the letters that we provided, which provide a little bit more detail on all of these comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And we'll do one more and then we'll open it up for some responses from staff.
Mr. Chair, the next member of the public wishing to speak is Ms. Bowie, so I'll ask that she accept the invitation and go ahead when her microphone is live.
The floor is yours, Joan.
Please accept the invitation to unmute your microphone. There should be an icon appearing on your screen. Oh, sorry.
It was off for a second there, Joan.
I would just ask the member of the public to, again, click the unmute button.
Okay.
Here you go. You're on.
Yeah, again, maybe. Okay. So I've taken part in many meetings about these issues, but this evening I would like to limit my comments to the issues around transportation, because I have serious concerns about the safety and transportation, mostly related to the proposed number of residents, especially in the B and C zones. To quote, Appendix A, which was sent as part of your report tonight, page 7, Table 2 lists the person trip generation rate, number of people and jobs, and the total person trip generation for future development scenarios. The residential trip generation rate is consistent with the observed trip generation rates at 117 Park Street, end of quote. So my question is, why was 117 Park Street chosen for the trip generation rate? Given that the developers and owners of the current and future rental units are looking for student tenants, why wasn't the trip generation rate measured at 655 Princess, for example? To quote, given the uncertainty of the type of employment, the employment trip generation rate was set at 0.6 trips per job, which assumes that 60% of the employees will travel during the peak hour, end of quote. I find this statement makes absolutely no sense for the student population who come and go from their homes at all hours of the day and night. Again, from Appendix A, analysis of growth. The report states, quote, a large proportion of the employment growth occurs north and west of Williamsville, and therefore does not travel through Williamsville, end of quote. Why isn't the growth of Queens south of Williamsville considered in the employment calculations? We have been told that enrollment is to increase. Is there no significant flow of traffic turning south off Princess? My observation is that the foot and bike traffic going south increased in recent years. The city has put permit parking in the area because Queens staff and students parking needed to be controlled. Again, from Appendix A, page 6, which outlines the residential dwellings and populations and so on. So as you will see, the population at the time of this report today was 1,049. It is proposed to grow to a possible 12,970 as development progresses. This triples the original projection of the Williamsville Main Street study. The transportation report outlines the population by block. I understand how the approved units are calculated, but I do not understand how the approved number of people is calculated. Can the city control how many people live in a 2-bedroom apartment? Is the total population of Williamsville being considered in traffic flow issues? There have been and continue to be many infill projects just off Princess, such as 501 Frontenac, or the townhouse, as well as the townhouses at Alfred and Mac, who will surely be using the transportation corridor. Again, there is point, well, I won't read the point. Anyway, services, this is a quote from point 10E 1.4 actually. Service and drop-off area circulation shall not interfere with accessible pedestrian circulation. Since this happens now, how will that be stopped? How will you stop friends and family from waiting in their cars by the apartment building's front door? How has the seemingly exponential growth of home deliveries been accounted for in the operation and needs analysis, which is the Appendix A? Was there any count of delivery and service vehicles such as UPS, FedEx, pizza deliveries, and so on? How do you stop deliveries from blocking the bike and bus lanes as we currently see? With thousands more residents and few loading zones, it's hard to understand how pedestrians will be safe. From page 39 of the report, quote, the city reports that development of convenient, accessible, and appealing streetscapes through such measures as providing wide sidewalks, street furniture, trees, and amenities, and including transit stops, end of quote. Would it be possible for this to read that the city requires, as opposed to supports, convenient, accessible and appealing streetscapes, etc. For example, we know that over 1,000 people will live on the north side of Princess Street between Albert and Frontenac. Surely there is a planning formula for the required sidewalk width for that number of people to enter and exit their residential buildings with their bikes, their books, their groceries, without blocking the pedestrian throughway. As well, there is expected to be storefront activity and the traffic it will generate, plus a bus stop. The width of the current sidewalk,
30 seconds.
no 1 meter setback, appears to me to be completely inadequate. The final paragraph of this transportation report reads, "It is critical to develop a vision for the study area's transportation network. This operational assessment should be revised once the vision has been developed to develop how the needs of the transportation modes can be balanced to support the growth of Williamsville and the city of Kingston." I think it needs to be more than a vision. We need a plan now to be put in place with wide sidewalks, clear intersections, appropriate size bus stops, and better understandings of the type of traffic and its flow in the area. Ideally, this plan will be in place before the interim control bylaw is
Thank
lifted.
you very much. Thank you, Ms. Bode. I'll now open it up for staff to respond to that whole series of, I believe it was 6 people we heard.
Perhaps we'll start with, oh, sorry, Ms. Agnew wishes to speak first. So
Please do.
there.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. So just to acknowledge, there was certainly a lot of feedback provided through Mr. Grenville, Mr. Keane, Mr. Leclerc, and Ms. Bowie. So just wanted to thank them and acknowledge their comments. There were a lot of statements and some questions as well. With respect to some of the comments that specifically Mr. Leclerc was raising, we acknowledge that there are likely property owners that are within the corridor that are going to warrant for further discussion on this and would like to have an opportunity. So again, just focusing on process, this is the public meeting. This is an initial offering with respect to policy recommendations. And as typical in the planning process, we're going to take that feedback and evaluate it as staff and see if we need to modify recommendations based on the feedback that we receive and whether or not we can support that from a planning perspective. So that definitely is going to be part of the process. And I just want to reinforce that for the committee and for the members of the public. Mr. Keane and Mr. Leclerc certainly know that as members of the professional planning community. So we are open and will facilitate those conversations as needed as a follow-up to this meeting. Certainly want to acknowledge Mr. Grenville's comments, and I think Councillor Neal, these dovetailed well with some of your comments with respect to looking at vegetation, parkland taking, and some of the challenges that the community has felt in terms of how we've dealt with things to date. I know my colleague, Mr. Semple, is on this call as well, and he will be able to provide some more specific comments with respect to where we are in the implementation of green streets. I do want to acknowledge Mr. Grenville's comments. We are holding money with respect to community benefits from 2 of the proposed developments, or approved developments, I should say, in Williamsville, and those will be subject to community consultation to direct those funds accordingly, which could include greening or other types of opportunities. So that is work that will still happen, and we are holding those funds. I also want to acknowledge Mr. Grenville's comments with respect to rear transition and concern about the perceived de-emphasis on the rear transition to residential streets versus what we're seeing on the Princess Street side of things. So as we're looking at trying to ensure that we're creating a policy framework that is in fact buildable and achievable, we had to evaluate the use of the angular plane. And I think the 45-degree angular plane, as is pretty evident in the one sketch that we showed you, showed that almost like tiered wedding cake approach to the back of buildings that was prescribed or is prescribed by our current approach. So we were really trying to evaluate that from a reasonableness perspective in terms of the overall building envelope, knowing we wanted to stay at a 6-story scale as the prevailing scale within the corridor, and looking at how we could treat that differently with some step backs above the 4th floor, and then certainly also looking at that 8-meter setback, acknowledging Mr. Grenville's comments as well with what are functional elements? Would that include potential drive lanes, and that being a concern that he identified specifically? So staff have noted that and acknowledged that concern. With respect to Mr. Keen's comments, I also wanted to provide the committee with and the public with some additional information. Certainly the land economics does represent an important new lens that we're bringing to the planning development process within the city from a policy perspective. Certainly the development community, this is a critical part of what takes place, or any type of investor when you're looking at creating the opportunities for investment or a project, the pro forma and the financial success of that project being key driving factors. So as Mr. Todderan noted, I think we have made some excellent strides in the recognition of understanding land economics and the influence that it plays within the individual community and the marketplace that takes place, and how important our planning policy is into influencing that market. To those ends, we will be hosting a separate session specifically on the land economics, although as Ms. Gummo identified, that document specifically was made available through the addendum that was released a few weeks ago. We recognize that there would likely be an interest in some more detailed conversation, and particularly from some members of the development community would certainly want to challenge some of the assumptions or know more about the assumptions that went into the analysis and get into more of a detailed discussion. And for those reasons, we thought it would be appropriate to host a separate session that was just focused on the land economics. So we're in the process of working to schedule that. It will be open to members of the public, and we also will have members of the Watson team that we work directly with on the creation of that document to be part of that session, so that we can delve more into a detailed conversation around the pro forma analysis, the assumptions that fed into that, and specifically taking feedback and answering questions of clarification. So we will post that publicly and advertise that in the weeks to come, and certainly in advance of when we're going to be looking to bring this back to the committee. At this point, I know that Mr. Semple has some comments specifically. I know there are some transportation related questions, and specifically from Ms. Bowie looking at some of the assumptions that went into the trip generation model. So I'm going to mute my microphone and defer to Mr. Semple on that to address those comments.
Mr. Semple.
Yes, good evening, and through you, Mr. Chair. So I think it may be helpful to frame the stage of the transportation analysis and where we are to answer some of these questions. So this component of the transportation analysis is the first phase, and it was what it was done for was to look at the capacity of the existing transportation network, the roads, the intersections, the sidewalks, and the places that exist right now in the right-of-way to support both the existing development, what is there today, and what is approved. And so that analysis was done to then inform, whether additional infrastructure or the infrastructure was required, and what changes would be needed for potential growth scenarios or the ultimate growth scenario. So in looking at that analysis, the study does conclude that the existing infrastructure, the right-of-way and the way that it functions and it's in place right now works for the existing and improved development, but it recognizes that for additional growth and for the way that Williamsville is intended to develop, there needs to be much greater emphasis on pedestrian uses and transit support through that corridor, especially on Princess Street, but also the adjacent side streets. And so what this stage of the study recommends is to move to a more detailed analysis of actually what Princess Street and the intersections and associated side streets would then look like to realize that approach. So this is this helps us sort of understand the type of the uses that we are going to prioritize in the corridor, and it very much is supportive of a pedestrian and public transit approach as envisioned both in the original 2012 study and in what we're seeing in the vision now. So in order to do that work, there are some assumptions that that were made. So Ms. Bowie asked a couple of detailed questions about how the model was set up, the way the analysis was done. I would be happy to follow up with her on those individual details. I can say that her first question, as it related to the use of a particular property, 117 Park Street, to set it as a component to calibrate the model. It was selected as, we did look at a variety of properties and developments in the neighborhood. It was the most, quote, conservative approach in that property in that it had the highest use of automobiles. So we were trying to assess the situation where there was the most use of vehicles so we could understand the impact on that network. That is not to say that that is the way the network is being designed for or will ultimately be designed for. It certainly is intended to be a pedestrian focused area that allows the non-auto modes and active modes to be prioritized. That is the work that is to come, is the next phase of the transportation study. And that speaks into, it speaks to some of those components that were in the original 2012 study, like green streets, that have yet to be implemented. I think concepts like green streets, a pedestrianized environment, transit supportive development, and a transit supportive corridors are all still in line with the vision and ultimate build out of what the Princess Street corridor would look like. So it's true those concepts have yet to be implemented, like many of the concepts that were included in the original Williamsville plan. But they are not discounted or dismissed as part of the next stage of work that we would do. They certainly would form part of the discussion as we develop that more detailed design of the corridor and the intersections so that they are a pedestrian and transit supportive design.
Great. Thank you very much. Are there any further comments regarding from any of our staff?
Mr. Chair, I believe for the most part, all the questions have been resolved. There are two members of the public that still wish to speak. So perhaps we'll commence with Mr. Martin.
Them.
And then I believe Mr. Tao is on deck.
Thank you.
Good evening, Mr. Chair, members of council. I'd like to have staff comment on parking, where the parking will be. I know you're trying to have more retail on Main Street, such as clinics. Park, according to the Watson report, they say all scenarios assume one parking space per residential unit, while no parking spaces for non-residential component are assumed. And I know there is a bit of an issue with people trying to go to clinics and trying to find parking spots. I guess they'd be on the side streets. Is that correct? And I'll leave those questions for later, of course. Also, Forma, and I'm not sure if Eric Carvin is there or not, but of the four scenarios that are there, according to their conclusions, 3 of them do not work and 1 does, possibly. And it is, of course, the wood frame building components that would work. And I'm sure at the moment you're well aware that there is a shortage of lumber, and some of the people that are building out of wood at the moment are struggling trying to find lumber in family residential units. I'm also looking at the utilities, and I'm reading in their conclusion on water, they say where development projects involve construction techniques employing brick, concrete, steel, etc., we do not foresee any capacity issues throughout the Williamsville planning area. Where wood frame construction is being proposed, the additional capacity demand triggered by that construction technique is a concern that would require review during the planning approval process. And maybe Mr. Miller could comment a little bit on that. I was also wondering if we're focused so much on the Williamsville of the city with regard to developing and capacity. I'm always curious to understand where the capacity for utilities such as water and sewer and electricity and gas are as far as other parts of the municipality. And when we're trying to plan where does it make the most sense to go? I know they're talking about green lighting and trying to open up different areas easier to develop, but there must be more than just the Williamsville area. The other question I had was, have we done a bit of a study to see what is the market that wants to live in the Williamsville area? I mean, this I don't know, but most of it would be students. But I am curious, are we talking about young families? Would there be 3-bedroom apartments? I'd just be interested whether we've done a study on that as well, or we know who our market is. Mr. Chairman, I'll leave it at that, and if someone could answer those questions, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Martin, and well within your 5 minutes. Thank you. Who's next, James?
Mr. Chair, I'm currently not seeing any members of the public with their hand raised. Oh, there's one there. So we'll now turn to Mr. Tao, who has a PowerPoint presentation. So I'll turn on his microphone, and then please just allow me a moment or two to look at the slides.
Thank you. The floor is yours, Mark, and you have 5 minutes.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee and the public. So I'm presenting tonight specifically with respect to the commercial ground floor uses component of the Williamsville Main Street study and policies. Next slide. So as you may be aware, I'm a planner with IBI Group, and in this particular instance, we're representing the owner of 630 Princess Street, which is a 4.5-story mixed-use development within the central part of Williamsville, developed with some ground floor commercial and 4 floors of residential. Next slide. So 3 main points: challenge, reality, and goal. So the challenge within Williamsville from a commercial standpoint is that there are high commercial vacancy rates. The reality, whether we like it or not, is that there's been a decline of traditional brick and mortar retail. Physical stores have, especially in downtown type settings or Main Street settings, have struggled. And unfortunately, the coronavirus pandemic has certainly created an even worse situation for those types of businesses. And finally, the goal is, as expressed through the study, is how do we provide active streetscapes given these challenges to traditional retail that we would rely upon to create that activity on the sidewalk for pedestrians. Next slide. So the challenge, so just providing some numbers here for context to provide the committee with an understanding of the current situation. So as of today, based on 3 sources for commercial realty listings. There's approximately 23 commercial units for lease on Princess Street in Williamsville. So between Kingston Center to Division Street. That's about 49,000 square feet of available space. For some context, the 2016 commercial land study that the city did identified a vacancy rate of 6.8%. That was equivalent to 26,600 square feet. We now have 49,000 square feet. So, the vacancy rate seems that it's currently in excess of 10% in terms of commercial vacancy on the corridor. This doesn't include 4 large-scale projects that are all proposing major land or major ground floor commercial, all totaling about 33,000 square feet in total. Obviously, that will bring some residential with it as well, but we're increasing the current available, or increasing or adding to the current inventory of commercial by more than 50%. So, 83,000 or 82,000 square feet if they were all built and operating today. Next slide. So as I said, the reality is that traditional brick and mortar retail, particularly on main streets, is struggling and has been hit even more so by the coronavirus pandemic recently. And so we're seeing what has been a trend become a rush and permanent shift to traditional retail and even office. Retail is often preferred at ground level, but offices are often a secondary use that we'd like to see as planners. And as most of us are aware, office uses and needs are shifting, looking at the hollowing out of some major cores in cities as companies choose to move their employees to remote working permanently or on a long-term basis. So that is something that I don't think we can avoid. It's a reality that we have to face. Next slide. So the goal is, how do we provide active streetscapes given the challenges to traditional retail? As Andrea Gummo noted, and as was raised by Councillor Hill, currently the plan is proposing to maintain the mandatory ground floor commercial, but we're concerned that this will lead to a continuation of the empty storefronts that we're seeing. And so we're encouraging staff in the city to consider looking at adapting some flexible policies to allow for current situations and also emerging trends when it comes to retail, possibly expanding the ground floor residential permissions in appropriate locations. And then if that's considered, then to adapt guidelines to create residential that will contribute to the streetscape in meaningful ways. The idea being that it's better to have residential at grade than it is to have a lot of vacancies at grade. And there just does not seem to be a high probability that we're going to see a major turnaround in brick and mortar retail. And so it's a concern I think that the city should examine closely in the context of this document. And that's everything. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there anybody else in the queue, James?
Perhaps we'll give a first and last call. If anyone else would like to speak, please use the raise hand function. And I'm not seeing anyone else, Councillor Neal, so I will let you proceed.
Excellent, thank you. We will now go to staff to address those comments and questions. Who would like to jump in? It's really hard not seeing people. Thank you, Mr. Oh, maybe it wasn't Mr. Miller. Are there any?
Sorry, Mr. Miller. I think we're playing tag here with the unmute button, but please go ahead.
Thank you.
Sorry, I should just confirm I am on.
Yes, I can hear you clearly.
All right, thank you. Perhaps I'd just like to respond, I guess, to a couple of the questions that I think were directed to Utilities Kingston with respect to the issue of utility services. And I believe, and I will apologize, the audio was sort of cutting in and out periodically, so I'm not sure I caught the full gist of the questions, but I think I understand the one question to be a reference to a comment in the report around the provision of water for structures that would use brick concrete mortar, or what I would term to be non-combustible material type, and the fact that the provision of water to meet fire flow demand under those circumstances was adequate, but that there was a concern with respect to the 6-story buildings that might use wood frame. And that comment is generated by the fact that the volume of water for fire suppression for combustible type material used in that type of construction is different from the non-combustible type. And our analysis of the water system in that area is such that there is some concern about whether or not the system will respond for full fire flow during those types of conditions, should there be an event that actually coincides with a peak demand in the system as well. So it's always, these situations are always modeled on a worst case scenario. So it's not an issue of providing water for domestic use, it's an issue of providing enough water to ensure that if an event happens, that there's sufficient volume of water in the system to be able to suppress. So we have been undertaking some further detailed modeling of the system in that area. What I can say is that the numbers are, I'll say close, but we need more detail to be able to validate whether or not there's an issue here or not. So that modeling is underway. We're also in discussions with the fire department to understand what their requirements would be better under these types of conditions. The third thing is, as I said, most of the analysis at this time has been done through detailed modeling. But in order to validate some of the results that we're seeing from the modeling, we will be undertaking actual field testing over the next several weeks to sort of validate the numbers that we're seeing and determine whether or not there's a concern here or not based on the existing system. And if there is a concern, what types of things can be done to improve that flow. So those things are all underway right at the moment. And we'll certainly be hoping to get back to planning with more definitive answers on that question, but that's why the concern was raised. I think there was a general question around sort of other utilities and general capacity questions. That's a rather broad question that impacts the entire system across the city. There are some areas where we know there are some what I would call general capacity issues because they might be related to a facility. There are other areas in the city that doesn't necessarily exist. So I'm not really sure quite how I answer that, but other than to say we do have some general understandings around capacity that is available in our systems or not available in the systems. Sometimes the answer to those questions is dependent upon the nature of the development and the amount of development being proposed. So I think that's I think what I heard were the two questions, and if I've missed something, I maybe would be happy to answer them later. But I think those were the questions that I heard.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. And I believe there were some other comments and questions. Who else would like to speak to them?
Ms. Agnew would like to speak, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Agnew.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to just acknowledge the feedback that was provided by Mr. Chow with respect to ground floor commercial. That is something certainly we've been looking at as staff, and I'm definitely familiar with the challenges of the one property, 630 Princess Street, that he's spoken of, as well as some of the others that were shown in photographs within his slide deck. I do think that he's making an excellent point. He is spot on in terms of his knowledge of the inventory that's there, as well as some of the overall recommendations and findings of the citywide commercial study that we did a few years ago. So I do believe that there's some really excellent feedback there and something for us to look at. We do acknowledge also too, as we've been going through this process, that the world has shifted significantly over the last 5 or 6 months with respect to its overall thinking on retail from where we were even at Christmas time. So we're happy to take that feedback and provide some greater contemplation on it. Certainly there are areas with that do require mandatory ground floor commercial. happy to look at that. As he acknowledged, and I do agree with him professionally, the key outcome is looking at having amenities to support the people that are living within the community, but also most importantly, or as importantly, the way that the pedestrian realm functions in the area, the space, the walkability, the vibrancy of the area, what draws people in, what keeps you in that area. And it's very much dictated by the uses that are there, the design of the spaces, and how comfortable and welcoming it feels. So there are ways to certainly achieve that by way of great residential design with buildings that land and have, accesses that are a little bit removed and somewhat private, but also close enough to have eyes on the street and people really connecting with the space. We have explored some of that in greater detail through a few of the developments that have been approved for Williamsville. 575 Princess Street comes to mind, as well as 652 Princess Street. Mr. Todern worked with us on both of those developments, and certainly willing to apply some greater thinking to the points that he's raised specifically, and have some further conversations with Mr. Tao and who he represents through the process to follow over the next couple months. So thank you for that, Mark. Believe with respect to some of the questions or comments that were raised and points of clarification by Mr. Martin with respect to parking location, commercial parking, Ms. Gummo and Mr. Semple are going to provide some feedback on those questions specifically. I'm going to mute my microphone.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. So in terms of the parking that was included in the pro forma analysis, it was based on what's required right now for residential. We didn't include commercial parking in that because what we were really trying to do was have kind of a conservative base case for what would give us a sense of what might be financially viable. But we certainly recognize that commercial parking requirements, especially in sort of a healthcare clinic setting, can be a really important component, especially for accessibility as well. We are looking at reducing the overall ratio of residential parking for the corridor 2.5. And that is in line with a number of the approvals that have gone forward in recent years. And we do think that that combined with the increased focus on active transportation and transit use in the corridor, we think that's going to work essentially. But I'm gonna let Ian speak to the details of that. Thank you.
Mr. Semple.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I think to build on what Ms. Mo is saying, the longer term growth and the way that Williamsville grows will be very much contingent on the types of trips that are occurring being non-auto based. And that will also impact the way in which parking is provided and the amount of parking that's provided. So the space that we have available in our right-of-way will certainly be prioritized for pedestrians and for transit use. And the on-street parking that exists certainly in the Princess Street corridor, but likely in many areas on the side streets as well, would need to be removed or need to be reviewed and potentially removed to allow the infrastructure that best supports pedestrians and active transportation in particular to be elevated. So that it's also about so that in the long run that parking shifts to and right-of-way changes to best accommodate the types of trips that would be occurring in this area.
Thank you.
Apologies. I wanted to add one point that I neglected to mention based on one of Mr. Martin's comments. He was asking about whether we know who the market is in terms of, demographics and different, like the kind of composition of units, that sort of thing. We do actually have some pretty good information on that, in part because of some of the work that was done to support the Mayor's Task Force on Housing. So we do know that there's a strong demand for 1 and 2 bedroom apartments in the city. But we also, when we're reviewing kind of a large multi-residential development, we really do encourage as much as possible to see a mix of unit sizes. And part of the idea for that is that it can accommodate various kind of configurations of humans living together or alone at different stages of life. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that covers the questions and comments that were made. And is there anybody else in the queue, James?
At this time, Mr. Chair, I believe that is everything.
Okay, I will now open it up to the committee to make any further comments or questions. Seeing none, could you take the chair, Ms. Osanek? Two quick comments. Ground floor commercial. I've heard a lot about that being the district councillor. And I know in the past we have demanded that they be ground floor commercial ready, but then we've approved it being becoming a residential if it had been vacant for some time. I think that that's a kind of Band-Aid short-term remedy for that. But clearly, I think perhaps we need to look at more residential and still have adequate commercial. But I agree with the comments that probably we have a surplus of that. The other comment, there were a couple of people that talked specifically about properties and how they wanted to expand the boundary of the corridor, and also talking about how they'd be right across the street from another 10-story and that was should give them the right to build there. I just want to remind people that part of the concern that spurred this whole issue of an interim control bylaw was the fact that we have a very narrow street in Princess Street with very narrow setbacks. And there was a concern expressed by the community, but also by myself and others, that what we were going to end up doing if we allowed a 10-story tunnel or corridor to be developed is that there would be wind issues and tunneling issues that took place. So just a heads up to the planners who want to say to me, I should support this because it's right across the street from another 10-story one. You just convinced me probably not to support it for exactly that reason. There is a concern about a canyon or tunneling effect along the corridor. So that's clearly a concern. And expanding into the neighborhood A zones, expanding the boundary might be good finances for people who own property along the corridor, but it would be contrary to the commitment and the intent of the original plan, which was to protect established, stable neighborhoods. And for those reasons, I think that, and I know this is first blush, but I think that this is a plan that's going in the right direction. And I've spoken too long, so I will shut up now. Would you want to return the chair? Thank you. I think that smile meant return the chair. Any other comments regarding this? Okay, thank you very much, everybody. This was a long, but I think a very beneficial meeting. So I will declare this public meeting closed, and we'll move on to, I can just find it, to our regular planning committee meeting, number 13-2020. I'll call the meeting to order. Approval of the agenda, a mover and a seconder. Councillor Sanik, Councillor Hill. All those in favor? And that's with the addendum. Confirmation of minutes. We have two, one from July 9th and one from July 16th. Yes, Councillor Sanik moved, seconded by Councillor Hutchison. Any comments or questions? Seeing none, all those in favor? Carried. So disclosure of pecuniary interest. Seeing none, we have no delegations, we have no briefings. I will read the business portion of this, and then I have a quick comment about, actually I'll do the comment now because it has to do with the agenda. I just want to remind members of the committee and members of the public that what is before us is exclusively to look at the issues surrounding the laneway behind 120 and 130 Albert Street and 142 to 154 Albert Street. We had a bump up of site plan, and that site plan bump up was, we had a very thorough public input on that. So the only thing we should be focused on now is dealing with issues surrounding the laneway. Having said that, anything else or direction of the committee would require a reconsideration motion of the what got passed regarding our earlier site plan bump up. Okay, does that make sense? I hope so. I don't always. Thank you very much. So I'll read the business portion. This portion of the meeting is open to the public. The city has initiated a new process in which members of the public will have the opportunity to speak for up to 5 minutes on comprehensive reports presented before the planning committee. Those wishing, just to lose my screen, those wishing to provide oral comments at this meeting will be invited to do so. If a person or public body would otherwise have an ability to appeal the decision of the council or corporation of the city of Kingston to the local planning appeal tribunal, but that person or public body does not make oral submissions at a public meeting or make written submissions to the city of Kingston before the bylaw is passed, that person or public body is not entitled to appeal the decision. So we'll now open up for staff to introduce the topic of the laneway issue.
Mr. Chair, it's Alan McLeod. Just let me know you can hear me.
Yes, I can.
So the information report before you is primarily to let you know that the condition related not to the laneway so much as a court action has been not met, as set out in the report. The condition was that someone, a person, no person commences a proceeding in competent jurisdiction claiming fee simple ownership. And that claim, it's my understanding, has not been met because the claim that's been brought says basically one of things, that the municipality owns it or a group of individuals abutting the lane collectively own it. The claim is brought by a group of entities, a person and two corporations that I understand own some of the properties abutting the lane, but not all of them. And the nature of the claim that's brought in relation to that isn't really fee simple. It's a collective, they're looking for a declaration by the court of collective ownership. So as I said in the report very briefly, some months ago, perhaps even over a year ago, we satisfied that ourselves that this is one of the lanes out there in the city that we don't have this claim under the Surveys Act in relation to, because there's sufficient indication that the intention of the survey was to create a private lane. And one of those clear indications was the survey has written on it the words private lane. We do own by operation lanes and portions of lanes through this action available under the Surveys Act, but this does not appear at all to be one of them. So that means that the condition that somebody is claiming fee simple ownership hasn't arisen here. So that means, as set out in the report, that we are free to proceed with the site plan negotiation under the referral to staff that the condition is in relation to. I would also point out, because there's been some discussion on this, we're not taking any position on the merits of the case between the parties, Queens and the McKinnon Group, that are involved in the court case. We obviously do have a position on our own municipal relations interests, but we make no comment of the other. Procedurally, though, it's important to understand that questions of land ownership and the property rights is something that sits with the court system and not through the planning process. We're helped in this understanding by a case that came out just in last December, where the court discusses the relative role of its own jurisdiction in relation to figuring out who owns and what real property rights over a certain parcel. And the court says the jurisdiction of the court is not ousted by the LPAT Act or the Planning Act. This is a core jurisdiction that can't be outsourced to administrative tribunal. But then the court also says the court has no jurisdiction to meddle with the municipality and LPAT jurisdiction to approve site plans. So what it's saying is there's two streams that go along side by side that relate to the same land, but their jurisdictions in two different bodies, and the higher body is always the court, of course. So the court is set out these two streams and said they coexist. It's also interesting in the case to point out that at this point, when the judge is making these statements and is ruling, it is the matter is already before the LPAT too. And the point is, these two processes just go along side by side. And even though they're obviously closely related in facts, the jurisdiction over the planning aspect is with the LPAT and municipality prior to the LPAT, and the jurisdiction over property rights sits with the court system. So again, we make no comment on the merits between the parties, between themselves, but we do acknowledge that the property right question always sits with the courts. And those are my comments.
Thank you, Mr. McLeod. Any questions or comments from, yes, Councillor Hutchison.
So I take it from that, the claim made directly by the McKinnon Group and other residents in the area is that the city should not proceed before the settlement of ownership of the lane is settled itself. So the fact that we're not taking a position on the property rights or ownership issue, it doesn't answer that, it seems to me, because it's a question of precedence. It's a question of whether we should go ahead in the absence of knowledge of the ownership, and whether our processes or our decision-making would be impaired by not knowing that. So I'm wondering if Mr. McLeod can shed some light on that.
The consideration set out in the court ruling gives us the guidance that the interest of one over the other being first could easily frustrate in either direction. And the example that the court ruling provides us with is that you actually don't wait one or the other first. The two processes go side by side. In this case, we are mentioning in the report that Queens is offered to indemnify the city should anything arise that could cause a liability that the city might suffer. But the point that's underlying that is, knowing the situation, the parties proceed at their own risk as well. We, in the municipal sphere, don't solve all the problems. The property rights questions become resolved through the court process and not through the planning process. So that's why they run concurrently, but independently of each other.
Thank you.
So will we accept that indemnification by Queens?
It would seem to be a reasonable intention to accept it. We are also, attending on our own behalf to make sure through the court case that our interests are protected, but also the indemnification through the site plan is a form of security that the municipality take comfort in as we go forward in the process.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions from the committee? Seeing none, I just have one quick comment if I could. Thank you, Councillor Sanik. I know I brought this up, I believe, at the site plan bump up, but I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Queens has in fact told all the adjoining properties along the laneway that they will be given legal easement to have the right to use the laneway. Is that accurate? Is that a question for Mr. McLeod, I believe?
Well, I could mention that in the report, it states that Queens has confirmed that existing property access rights enjoyed by the abutting owners will continue, even in light of an expropriation process that Queens has suggested they will proceed with. And again, we make no comment on the merit of that or how it will play out, but they have confirmed whatever happens is part of that the access rights enjoyed by abutting landowners will continue.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So, seeing no further, I believe I saw Ms. Morley's was on there for a second. Go ahead.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to also add that, yes, you are correct. In a previous legal opinion that we received from Cunningham Swan back in January, who was acting for Queens, they confirmed that if there are any property owners that abut the laneway and use that laneway and do not currently enjoy a legal easement, they will be granted one by Queens upon request.
So they would enjoy the same rights if they did have some joint, even if they haven't an easement now, there would be one provided. Is that accurate?
That is correct, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. So, seeing no other hands, I will go to our clerk. And are there any members of the public that would wish to speak?
So we just ask that members of the public please use the raise hand tool if they wish to speak. Currently, Mr. Chair, I do not see anyone with their hand raised. However, I will just mention that if you click on the participants icon in the bottom menu, followed by the raised hand button on the right hand of the screen, you're able to speak. However, Mr. Chair, I do not see anyone.
Okay. So I will declare that portion of the meeting over.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, there is one.
Oh, go right ahead.
All right, just 1 second, please. Go ahead, Ms. Meadows.
The floor is yours, Ms. Meadows. If you just tap the button. There you go. You're on.
So my name is Gail Meadows, and I live at 145 Albert Street, and I do abut onto the laneway, and I do have the right to access the lane. It's in the deed with my house. I was alarmed when I saw these letters that went back and forth with the lawyers, and when I saw that there was a meeting tonight, I was concerned that this is to actually give permission to go forward with the site plan. Is that what the meeting is about? Because the reality is, I think it's premature. The ownership of the lane is totally in question at this point. And it's either, as you say, in the court, does this belong to the city? Does it belong to the province? Or is it a common area? And I think this whole question has to be resolved because it does influence the Queen's planning for this residence. As you know, most of us think it's just going to be, we don't want it there, but obviously it's going to be there. But it's just too big. And it's going to change. Our neighborhood is being destroyed with them tearing down houses prematurely and trees and everything already. And they have blocked the lane.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Ms. Meadows, but I just want to remind you that the only, all of those things were dealt with at site plan.
All right, I'm off topic here. My point is, I'm concerned that you're going to give, I just think this is premature until the laneway ownership has been resolved. Until that happens, I don't think there should be any approval for this plan. We are very concerned about it. I guess that's my point. I'm also, well, I'm concerned about the threat of expropriation as well. From whom do you expropriate something if you don't know who owns it? So I think to keep hearing this threat for expropriation, from whom are you going to expropriate it if you don't even know who owns the lane? So I would really like that resolved before this whole thing goes forward. That's my comment.
Excellent, thank you. If there aren't any further members of the public, I think that sounds like a legal question to me. So if either Mr. McLeod or Ms. Morley could respond to that.
So I can reiterate that, again, we take no position as to the ownership because that's a matter that will be before the courts. It's, again, the precedent is that the two processes run concurrently. One does not wait for the other. And I see that Mr. Fleming, who represents Queens in this matter, has his hand up. I would, perhaps we could hear from him at this point.
Thank you. Mr. Fleming, the floor is yours. If you can just tap the unmute button, you'll be on. Thank you.
Can you hear me, sir?
I can.
All right, thank you. Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chairman, just a couple of points on the expropriation. Queens is not indicating that it is.
We seem to have lost you.
Mr. Fleming, having some audio issues. Are you able to hear us?
Yeah, we seem to have lost your audio, Mr. Fleming.
Mr. Chair, perhaps Ms. Morley could speak, and if Mr. Fleming wanted to try leaving the meeting and returning to the meeting using the same link, that might be helpful to reset his system.
Excellent. Do you want to weigh in, Ms. Morley?
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. I just did want to clarify that on the ownership piece, As we do in the ordinary course, legal services did conduct a title search of this property, and we did verify that Queen's University is the registered owner of the laneway on title. The document that we review is known as a parcel register, and it is the province's statement of title. Through this notice of application, there has been a challenge made to that title, but as of right now, Queen's is in fact the registered owner of the laneway.
Thank you, Ms. Morley. You want to try again, Tony? I see that your audio is on, but we still don't hear from you.
Mr. Chair, perhaps we could take a 2-minute recess and we can give Mr. Fleming the call-in number if you'd like to call in by phone.
That would be fine.
Up to you.
A mover and a shaker for a 2-minute recess. Thank you, Councillor Hutchison, seconded by Councillor Hill. All those in favor? Thank you. Good, I can let my dog out.
Mr. Fleming, I just sent you a phone number or an email containing the call-in number. If you'd like to try that option. Mr. Fleming, are you able to hear us? And your mic is live. If you're able to say something, please.
I can hear you, James. Can you hear me?
Yes, you sound very clear. I'll just allow the chair to let us know when we can continue.
Okay, great. Thank you.
There we go. So you're on, Mr. Fleming.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry about the technical difficulties. Not sure what that's all about. So just very briefly, Mr. Chairman, with respect to the expropriation, there's a few issues that I'd like to address. First of all, I think, as Ms. Morley indicated, the only registered owner of this laneway is Queens. So in the normal course, that is all the information or evidence that the city needs to identify Queens as the legal owner, because that's what the parcel register in the province of Ontario recognize. Obviously, in this case, we have an owner or owners who are alleging that they perhaps have some interest in the lane. But to Mr. McLeod's point, in terms of what the court application says, it actually asks the court to find that the city is the owner. And Mr. McLeod's confirmed this evening that, in fact, the city is not the owner in his view, and has no legal right to the lane. And then as a default position, Mr. McKinnon has asked the court to grant to him and to all adjacent owners joint ownership in the lane. But there's been no evidence advanced that they have any indicia of title or color of right to legal ownership of the lane. And in fact, in Mr. McKinnon's case, he requested and accepted from Queen's University approximately 10 years ago a legal right-of-way over the lane owned by Queen's. So there are a number of difficulties. Queen's has advanced the notion of expropriation not to suggest in any way that they believe there's any merit in the claim, but to give the city further comfort of two things. One, that Queen's has, if not legal title now, the legal ability to clean up any cloud on title that might exist. And second, to clearly identify that in these circumstances, Queen's is the only party that's suffering any prejudice by moving forward, because at the end of the day, the title issue, in my respectful opinion, has been settled by the province in terms of the land title system. If a court were to disagree, Queen's is simply saying to the city, the expropriation powers exist for us to clean up any residual issues with title, and there is only prejudice, if there's any prejudice at all, to Queen's in moving forward because it's the one at issue here, but it has the ability to sort that out one way or another, whether it's through the courts or through an expropriation process. So the other thing that I wanted to make clear is that the expropriation is not going to affect any rights of access over that laneway. So the expropriation is only to clear up any residual cloud that might be on title with respect to the fee simple ownership. Queen's is not intending and will not expropriate any of the legal rights of way that exist right now. Those have been in place for a number of years. They will continue for the foreseeable future, and Queen's is not intending to alter that in any way, shape, or form. So the folks who take access over the lane will continue to take access over the lane. And as you know, the site plan itself does not build upon the lane, so there is no prejudice to any abutting owner in terms of their access to the lane, because even as site plan unfolds, that access will be maintained.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chair, can I mention,
I'm sorry.
WMS, can I just share something with Mr. Fleming in the event that he wishes to speak again? Mr. Fleming, calling in through the phone now. You're required to hit *6 to raise your hand. So if you need to speak again, please hit the star button followed by the number 6. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll now go back to the committee. Are there any comments or questions regarding this? Seeing none. I don't believe, is there any action that we need to take, James? It's been a long night.
No, Mr. Chair, there is no action required of the
This was
committee.
information only. Okay.
Correct.
Thank you very much. So we will move on to the end of our agenda. Motions, none. Notices of motion, none. Other business, seeing none. Correspondence we've received. Date and time of the next meeting. September 3rd at 6:30. So, our favorite time of the night. Who would like to move adjournment? Thank you, Councillor Hutchison. Councillor Hill definitely wants to second. All those in favor? Carried. Now we can all go to bed. Thank you very much.